This happened back in 1981. I was a park ranger in Texas at the time, specifically in the Piney Woods region of East Texas, where the humidity clung to your skin like a second layer and the forest grew so thick you could lose yourself just 20 yards from the main trail. Not my most favorite job in the world, but it paid well, at least for where I was in my life, and I got to be outside in nature, something my younger self really enjoyed. The location where I was stationed was remote enough that I didn't see too many visitors myself, so my work was pretty quiet. Mostly I'd spend my days checking the perimeter fences, maintaining trail markers, and filing the occasional report about poachers or teenagers drinking beer around the fire pits. The nearest town was Carthage, about 45 minutes by truck on a good day, longer when the spring rains turned the back roads into muddy rivers. My ranger station was a small wooden cabin that the state had built in the late 1960s. It sat on a rise overlooking what we called Miller's Creek, though I never met anyone named Miller who could claim ownership to it. The creek ran year-round, fed by underground springs that kept the water cold even in the brutal Texas summers. At night, when the work was done and I'd settled in with a beer and whatever paperback novel I'd picked up in town, I could hear the water running over the rocks, mixing with the sounds of the forest settling in for the evening. That particular night in late September started like any other. I'd finished my rounds around 3 in the afternoon, filed my daily report with the regional office in Tyler, and was just settling in to heat up a can of chili for dinner when I heard something that made me stop cold. It wasn't the usual forest sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of night birds, the occasional crack of a branch falling. This was different. It was a sound like fabric tearing, but louder, more sustained, like someone dragging a heavy tarp across rough ground. I stepped out onto the small porch that wrapped around the front of the cabin, letting the screen door close softly behind me. The sun had just set, and that gray twilight that comes before full darkness was settling over the trees. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening, but the sound didn't repeat itself. I was about to go back inside when I saw it. I wasn't sure where it came from at first. I guess it just appeared out of nowhere, or maybe materialized, became visible, as if stepping into our dimension from another place. One moment the small clearing between my cabin and the tree line was empty, and the next moment there was something standing there that shouldn't exist. Taller than 6 feet, maybe 10 feet of that, while standing up straight on 2 legs with its head held up high. At first glance, in the dim light, I thought maybe it was just a person someone lost. Maybe, or one of those hippie types who sometimes wandered into the park looking for a place to set up camp away from the designated areas. But as my eyes adjusted and I got a better look, I realized this wasn't any person I'd ever seen before. It was less like an ape and more like the Grim Reaper's sadistic cousin, pale, not just white, but pale in a way that seemed to absorb the dying light around it. The face was almost human-like, with the basic arrangement of features you'd expect, but everything about this being was wrong. Elongated and pale, very thin, skeletal if you will. Its limbs were too long for its torso, giving it the appearance of something that had been stretched on a medieval rack. Its skin looked like parchment, thin enough that I could almost see the dark shapes of bones underneath. But what really unnerved me about the sighting of this creature was the face. Most importantly, I didn't see any eyes. They were just 2 large black holes, not closed eyes, not eyes hidden in shadow, complete absence. Where eyes should have been, there were just dark cavities that seemed to go deeper than they should, as if they were tunnels leading to some lightless place inside its skull. I'm sure you'd think nothing of it if you saw a person with eyes standing right in front of you, watching you, even if they were a stranger. There's something comforting about eyes, something human and familiar. But when you take away the eyes and give something the appearance this creature had, it becomes a whole other thing entirely. Without eyes, there was no way to tell what it was thinking, what it wanted, or even if it was aware of my presence. I didn't know exactly what to do when I saw it. My wits weren't quite quick enough to figure out how to react. Part of me wanted to call out, to ask if it needed help. Another part of me, the part that had been raised on too many late-night horror movies and campfire stories, wanted to run back inside and lock the door. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, watching this impossible thing as it stood in my clearing. As I continued looking out into the growing darkness at this creature that had somehow materialized out of nowhere, I noticed it appeared to be moving, slowly and deliberately, toward the forest. Not randomly, not like something lost or confused, but with purpose, like it was destined to be somewhere specific. It moved with an odd, gliding gait that didn't seem quite right for something walking on two legs. There was no bobbing of the head, no shifting of weight from side to side. It just moved forward in a straight line, as if it were floating a few inches above the ground. I watched it until it reached the tree line, where the darkness swallowed it up like it had never been there at all. For several minutes after it disappeared, I stood on that porch, straining my eyes and ears for any sign that what I'd seen was real. The normal sounds of the forest had returned: the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant call of an owl, the constant murmur of Miller's Creek. It was as if the appearance of the creature had temporarily silenced everything else, and now that it was gone, the world was cautiously returning to normal. My hands were shaking when I finally went back inside. I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon from the bottle I kept for emergencies and tried to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. In 1981, people weren't as quick to jump to supernatural explanations as they might be today. We didn't have the internet, didn't have cable TV bringing us constant streams of paranormal shows and documentaries. Most folks in East Texas were practical people who believed in what they could see and touch and understand. So I tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was someone in a costume, some college kid from Stephen F. Austin up in Nacogdoches, playing an elaborate prank. Maybe it was someone on drugs, someone whose mind had been scrambled by too much LSD or whatever else was popular at the time. Hell, maybe it was just the way the light was hitting a dead tree, and my tired brain had filled in the details. But even as I tried to convince myself of these reasonable explanations, I knew I'd seen something that couldn't be explained away so easily. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning came gray and humid, with a low ceiling of clouds that promised rain later in the day. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, dozing fitfully in my chair with the bourbon bottle within arm's reach. Every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of wind in the trees, had me jumping awake and reaching for the flashlight I'd placed on the table beside me. When dawn finally broke, I made myself a pot of coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe and tried to approach the situation like the professional I was supposed to be. Rangers dealt with unusual wildlife sightings all the time. There were established protocols for documenting and reporting them. But how do you write a report about something that shouldn't exist? I decided to start with what I could verify. If something that large had been in my clearing, there should be tracks, physical evidence. Something I could photograph and include in a report that wouldn't get me transferred to a desk job in Austin. The ground around the cabin was mostly hard-packed earth mixed with fallen leaves. Not ideal for preserving footprints, but if something weighing as much as the creature appeared to weigh had walked across it, there should be some sign. I spent an hour searching the area where I'd seen it, working in a grid pattern the way they'd taught us in training. Nothing. No compressed earth, no disturbed leaves, no broken twigs. It was as if the thing had left no more trace of its passage than a shadow would. That should have been the end of it. I should have written it off as a hallucination brought on by too much isolation and too many late nights reading Stephen King novels. But something about the memory of those empty eye sockets wouldn't let me drop it. Around noon, I made a decision that I knew was probably stupid but couldn't seem to stop myself from making. I was going to follow the path the creature had taken into the forest. I ran over to my truck and grabbed my shotgun from the gun rack mounted behind the seat. As a ranger, I was already used to hunting rogue dogs and the occasional aggressive wild hog. This tool would be useful in any scenario, though I wasn't entirely sure what good it would do against something that might not even be entirely physical. I loaded it with buckshot and tucked a handful of extra shells into my shirt pocket. The forest in this part of East Texas was thick enough to hide an army. Pine trees mixed with hardwoods, creating a canopy so dense that even at midday, the light that filtered through was dim and green. Vines and undergrowth created natural barriers that forced you to stick to the established trails or spend your time hacking your way through with a machete. I started at the spot where I'd last seen the creature and tried to follow what I thought might be its path. Without tracks to follow, I had to rely on other signs: broken branches, disturbed vegetation, anything that might indicate something large had passed through. For the first half hour, I found nothing. Then I started noticing small things that didn't seem quite right. A spider web strung between 2 bushes had been broken, but not in the random way that happens when an animal brushes against it. The break was clean, straight across, as if something had passed through it at exactly the right height. A few yards further on, I found a branch that had been snapped off a young pine tree. The break was fresh, the sap still sticky, but it was too high up for a deer or even a person of normal height to have caused it. I kept following these subtle signs deeper into the forest, farther from the established trails than I'd ever gone before. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out more and more of the daylight until I had to switch on my flashlight even though it was still technically afternoon. That's when I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't anything I could point to specifically, no sound, no movement in my peripheral vision, just a cold certainty that something was observing my progress through the woods. The back of my neck prickled, and I found myself stopping frequently to look over my shoulder. Each time I turned around, the forest behind me looked exactly as it should, trees and shadows and the occasional bird flitting between branches, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger the deeper I went. I'd been walking for maybe an hour when I came across the first clear sign that something was definitely wrong in these woods. It was a deer, a young doe, from the look of it. She was lying on her side in a small clearing, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd just been sleeping and I'd startled her. But when I got closer, I realized she was dead. Not just dead, there wasn't a mark on her, no bullet wound, no signs of predation, no obvious injury of any kind. She looked like she'd just laid down and died. I knelt beside the carcass and examined it more closely. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing, but they weren't clouded over the way eyes get when an animal has been dead for a while. This was fresh, so fresh that her body was still warm. Standing up, I played my flashlight beam around the clearing and found 2 more deer, both in the same condition, just lying there as if they'd dropped dead for no reason at all. The rational part of my mind started cycling through possible explanations. Disease maybe, or poison. There were plants in these woods that could kill an animal if they ate enough of them. But 3 deer, all dying at the same time, in the same small area, that didn't seem right either. And there was something else, something that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't quite explain. The deer weren't lying in natural positions. They were all oriented the same way, heads pointing deeper into the forest, as if they'd been walking in the same direction when whatever killed them struck. The same direction the creature had been heading. I stood in that clearing for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. The smart thing would have been to turn around and head back to the cabin. File a report about the dead deer, let the wildlife biologists figure out what had killed them. But something about the whole situation had gotten its hooks into me. Maybe it was professional curiosity, maybe it was just plain stubbornness, or maybe it was the memory of those empty eye sockets and the way the creature had moved with such obvious purpose. I needed to know where it had been going, so I kept following the trail, stepping carefully around the dead deer and pressing deeper into the forest. The feeling of being watched intensified until it was all I could do not to constantly look over my shoulder. 20 minutes later, I found myself standing at the edge of another, larger clearing. And in the center of that clearing, half hidden by overgrown vegetation, was something I'd forgotten was even out here. An old house, abandoned, from the look of it, for years. And every instinct I had was screaming at me not to go any closer. The house squatted in the clearing like something that had been waiting for me to find it. I knew about it, of course. It was marked on the survey maps in the ranger station, listed as a private inholding that predated the park's establishment. But seeing it on a map and standing in front of it were 2 entirely different experiences. It was a 2-story farmhouse that had probably been painted white at some point in its history, but now the paint hung in long strips from the weathered wood siding like diseased skin. The roof sagged in the middle, and several of the windows on the ground floor were boarded up with sheets of plywood that had gone gray with age and weather. What struck me most about the place wasn't its obvious decay, but how wrong it felt. There was something about the way it sat in the clearing, the angle of its walls, the spacing of its windows that seemed subtly off, like a photograph that had been hung just slightly crooked, creating a sense of unease that you couldn't quite put your finger on. If you go back far enough into these woods, there's this old dilapidated abandoned house on what used to be a secluded trail. Few people ever walked on it anymore, though it seemed like it was always a hot spot for local teenagers looking to do some things in private when they could sneak off the main trails. From what I understood, and this was just hearsay, mind you, people had reported weird things happening around this place for years. I'd never paid much attention to the stories before. Every remote location has its ghost stories and urban legends. But standing here now, looking at this house in the fading afternoon light, I was starting to think maybe there was more to those stories than I'd given them credit for. The trail of dead animals continued right up to the edge of the clearing. I counted 6 more as I approached the Hauser rabbits mostly, but also what looked like a raccoon and a small fox. All in the same condition as the deer I'd found earlier. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just lying there as if they'd simply stopped living. They were all positioned the same way too, heads pointing toward the house. I circled the building once before approaching it directly, my shotgun held ready, though I wasn't sure what I thought I might need to shoot. The windows on the ground floor that weren't boarded up were too dirty to see through, but I could make out what looked like furniture still inside, covered with dust and cobwebs. The front door hung open, sagging on rusted hinges. As I got closer, I could smell something coming from inside, not the musty odor of abandonment and decay that I'd expected, but something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat that had been left in the sun too long. I stopped at the threshold and called out, feeling foolish but not wanting to surprise anyone who might be inside. "Hello, anyone in there? This is Texas Parks and Wildlife." My voice echoed strangely in the empty space, seeming to go on longer than it should have, but there was no answer. I stepped inside. The interior of the house was dim, with shafts of dusty sunlight slanting through the gaps in the boarded windows. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and somewhere in the walls I could hear the scurrying of small animal mice, probably, or rats. The first floor seemed to consist of a living room, kitchen, and dining room, all connected by doorways that had lost their doors long ago. The furniture was still there, a sofa with springs poking through holes in the upholstery, a dining table with one leg shorter than the others, causing it to rock when the wind moved through the house. But it was what I found in the kitchen that made me stop cold. On the floor, arranged in a rough circle, were more dead animals. Dozens of them. Mice, rats, birds, squirrels, anything small enough to have wandered into the house. They were all positioned with their heads pointing toward the center of the circle, where someone had used what looked like charcoal to draw a symbol on the floor. I'd never seen anything like it. It wasn't a pentagram or any other occult symbol I was familiar with. It looked almost like a tree, but wrong somehow. The branches twisted in directions that hurt to look at, and the longer I stared at it, the more it seemed to shift and writhe, though I knew that had to be a trick of the dim light. The smell was stronger here. Not just decay, but something else. Something that reminded me of ozone, like the air during a thunderstorm, but mixed with something that made my stomach turn. I took several photographs with the old Polaroid camera I carried in my pack, though I wasn't sure who I'd be able to show them to. Then I made myself examine the circle more closely. The animals hadn't been killed here. There was no blood, no signs of violence. They'd been brought here and arranged, just like the others I'd found leading up to the house. But these had been here longer. Some were little more than bones and fur. This had been going on for a while. A creak from somewhere above me made me freeze. It was the sound of weight on old floorboards, slow and deliberate. Something was moving around on the second floor. I considered calling out again, but something told me that would be a mistake. Instead, I made my way quietly to the foot of the stairs, shotgun ready. The stairs themselves looked solid enough, though they protested with each step I took. At the top, a narrow hallway ran the length of the house, with doors leading off to what I assumed were bedrooms. The first door I tried opened onto a small room that had probably been a child's bedroom at one time. There was still a bed frame in one corner, and toys scattered on the floor, a wooden horse missing its wheels, a doll with no hair, building blocks that spelled out words I couldn't read in the dim light. But it was the walls that made my breath catch in my throat. They were covered with drawings, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, scratched into the plaster with something sharp, and they were all the same image, repeated over and over again. The creature I had seen the night before. The tall, thin figure with the elongated limbs and the empty eye sockets. But these drawings showed details I hadn't been able to make out in the darkness. The way its fingers ended in points that might have been claws, the way its mouth stretched wider than any human mouth should be able to go, the way it seemed to bend in the middle, as if it had too many joints. Some of the drawings were crude, like a child might make. Others showed considerable skill, with shading and perspective that created an almost photographic realism, but they all showed the same thing over and over again, until the walls looked like they were crawling with pale, eyeless figures. At the bottom of one wall, scratched deeper than the rest, was a single word: hungry. That's when I heard the sound from downstairs. The same sound that had first drawn my attention the night before, like fabric tearing, but louder, more sustained. And then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the rooms below me. I had been so focused on following the trail, on solving the mystery of what I'd seen, that I hadn't considered the possibility that the creature might come back. That it might follow the same path I had taken, drawn by whatever had brought it here in the first place. I moved to the window and looked down into the clearing. At first I saw nothing. Then at the edge of the tree line I caught a glimpse of something pale moving between the trees. It was coming back, and I was trapped in its house. I had maybe 5 minutes before the creature reached the house. The smart thing to do would have been to find another way out, a back door, a window on the opposite side from where I'd seen it approaching. But something about those drawings on the wall had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. This wasn't some random encounter. The creature had been here before, many times, and someone or something had been documenting its visits. I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I left this place. Moving as quietly as I could, I checked the other rooms on the second floor. The master bedroom was empty except for a metal bed frame and a wardrobe with doors that hung open to reveal nothing but dust and mouse droppings. But the third room, the smallest one at the end of the hall, stopped me in my tracks. It was set up like an office or study. There was a desk against one wall, still holding papers weighed down with stones to keep them from blowing away. Bookshelves lined the other walls, though most of the books had fallen or been knocked to the floor. And in the center of the room, pointing toward the single window that faced the clearing, was what looked like a telescope. Not a cheap department store telescope either. This was a serious piece of equipment, the kind an astronomer might use. But it wasn't pointed up at the sky. It was angled down, focused on the clearing where I'd first spotted the creature. I approached the desk carefully, aware that the footsteps downstairs had stopped. The papers scattered across its surface were covered with handwriting and faded ink. Some were hard to read, water-damaged and stained with what looked like coffee or tea, but others were clear enough to make out. The first sheet I examined appeared to be some kind of observation log. September 12, 1974, 11:23 p.m. Subject appeared at eastern edge of clearing, height approximately 10 feet, stood motionless for 17 minutes before moving toward house. No vocalizations observed. September 19, 1974, 12:45 a.m. Subject returned. Spent approximately 45 minutes in circle arrangement before departing. Left offering of 3 field mice. October 3, 1974, 2:15 a.m. Multiple subjects observed. Count 4. Behavior more agitated than usual. One approached within 20 feet of house before retreating. The entries continued for pages, spanning what looked like several years. Each one documented the creature's visits with scientific precision, times, durations, behaviors. But as I read further, the handwriting became less steady, the observations more frantic. November 15, 1976. They know I'm watching. The tall one looked directly at this window tonight. I don't think it has eyes, but it knew I was here. It knew. December 2, 1976. Found my dog dead in the yard this morning. No wounds, no signs of struggle, just like the others. They're sending me a message. December 20, 1976. I understand now. They're not just visiting, they're feeding, but not on flesh, on something else. Something that keeps the animals coming back, even though they know they'll die. January 8, 1977. I can't leave. Every time I try to pack, to get away from this place, I find myself unpacking again. Something won't let me go. I think I'm becoming part of whatever happens here. The final entry was dated March 15, 1977. They came for me tonight. I could see them in the clearing, all of them waiting. The tall one gestured for me to come down. I wanted to refuse, but my legs started moving on their own. If anyone finds this, don't try to understand it. Don't try to help, just stay away. Some things are meant to remain hidden. The hunger never stops. Below that, in different handwriting, shakier, as if written by someone who was ill or frightened, was a final note. Found father's body in the clearing this morning. Same as the animals. No wounds, no signs of violence, just empty. I should burn this place down, but I can't seem to leave. Something keeps drawing me back to the window to watch and wait. I think I understand now why he stayed. They're beautiful in their way, and so very, very hungry. Margaret Holloway, April 1977. I set the papers down with hands that were shaking harder than I cared to admit. The Holloways. I'd heard that name before, though I couldn't remember where. Maybe in the old records at the ranger station, or in conversations with local residents. A sound from downstairs made me freeze. Not footsteps this time, but something else. A low humming, almost musical, but wrong in a way that made my teeth ache. I moved to the window and looked down into the clearing. What I saw there made me understand why the Holloways had been unable to leave. There weren't just one or two of them now, there were dozens. They stood in a perfect circle around the house, motionless as statues. Each one was slightly different, some taller, some shorter, some with limbs that bent at impossible angles, but they all shared the same basic characteristics, that pale, stretched appearance. The two long fingers, the empty eye sockets that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And in the center of the circle, the one I'd first seen the night before stood directly beneath my window. Its head was tilted up at an angle that should have been uncomfortable for anything with a spine, and even though it had no eyes, I could feel it looking at me. The humming was coming from all of them, not quite a song, not quite a chant, but something that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. It was hypnotic, almost soothing, and I found myself relaxing despite the obvious danger of my situation. Part of me wanted to go downstairs, to open the front door and walk out into that circle, to understand what they wanted, what they were offering. The rational part of my mind was screaming warnings, but it seemed very far away, muffled by the humming that was growing louder and more complex. I forced myself to step back from the window, to break whatever hold their collective gaze was having on me. The humming immediately became more agitated, rising in pitch until it was almost painful to listen to. That's when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Something was climbing the outside wall of the house. I spun around just as a pale hand appeared at the edge of the window frame, followed by an arm that was far too long for any human body. The creature that pulled itself through the window moved with liquid grace, folding its impossible limbs to fit through the opening. Up close, I could see details that had been hidden in the darkness the night before. Its skin wasn't just palate, it was translucent, showing the dark shapes of organs underneath that didn't seem to be arranged quite right. Its mouth was a thin line that stretched from ear to ear, and when it smiled at me, I could see rows of teeth that looked like they'd been filed to points. But it was those empty eye sockets that held my attention. They weren't just dark, they seemed to go on forever, tunneling into some space that existed beyond the physical bounds of its skull. The creature tilted its head at an angle that would have broken a human's neck, studying me with those impossible non-eyes. When it spoke, its voice was like wind through dead leaves, soft and rustling and utterly inhuman. "You've been reading," it said, and somehow I understood that it was referring to the papers on the desk. Understanding, that's good. Understanding makes the transition easier. I raised my shotgun, though my hands were shaking so badly I wasn't sure I could hit anything. "Stay back," I managed to say, though my voice came out as little more than a whisper. The creature's smile widened, showing more of those needle-sharp teeth. "There's no need for that," it said in its wind voice. "We're not here to hurt you. We're here to offer you something much better." "What?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Purpose," it said. The Holloways understood eventually. They were like you, curious, seeking answers, and in the end, they found what they were looking for. The humming from outside had stopped, leaving a silence that was somehow worse than the sound had been. I could hear my own heartbeat, my ragged breathing, but nothing else. "What happened to them?" I asked. "They joined us," the creature said simply. "As you will, as all watchers eventually do. The hunger calls to hunger, and yours is growing stronger every moment you remain here." And that's when I realized it was right. Despite my fear, despite every instinct screaming at me to run, part of me wanted to stay. Part of me was curious about what would happen if I put down the gun, if I let them show me whatever it was they wanted to show me. The realization snapped me back to myself, at least partially. I'd been in the woods too long, exposed to whatever influence these things projected. I needed to get out, needed to get back to civilization and figure out what to do about this situation. But first, I needed to get past the creature blocking my path to the door. "You can't leave," the creature said, as if it had read my thoughts. Its voice carried a note of what might have been sympathy, if something without human emotions could feel sympathy. "Not anymore. You've seen too much, understood too much. The knowledge is already changing you." I kept my shotgun trained on its center mass, though I wasn't sure buckshot would do much good against something that might not even be entirely physical. "Watch me," I said, backing toward the door. The creature made no move to stop me, but that smile never left its too wide mouth. "Look outside," it suggested. "See how many of us there are. See how far you'd get." Against my better judgment, I glanced toward the window. The circle of pale figures had moved closer to the house. They stood shoulder to shoulder now, forming an unbroken ring. There had to be at least 50 of them, maybe more, and they were all perfectly still, all waiting. "They've been waiting for you specifically," the creature continued. "Ever since you saw me last night, they've been gathering. You called to us without realizing it. Your curiosity, your need to understand, it's like a beacon in the darkness." "What are you?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. "We are what comes after," it said. "What waits in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between knowledge and ignorance. Your species has a word for us, though it's inadequate. You would call us observers, watchers. We have been here much longer than your kind, and we will be here long after you are gone." It took a step closer, and I noticed that its feet didn't quite touch the floor. It hovered just above the old boards, as if gravity was optional for it. "The Holloways were the first to understand our purpose here," it continued. "They watched us, as you have watched. They documented our visits, tried to understand our patterns, and in doing so, they became part of something larger than themselves." "You killed them," I said. "No," the creature replied, and for the first time its voice carried something that might have been emotion. "Death is an ending. What we offered them was a continuation, a transformation. They became bridges between what is and what might be." I was backing down the hallway now, keeping the shotgun aimed at the creature even as it followed me with that same fluid, impossible movement. The stairs were just a few feet away. "The animals," I said. "All those dead animals. What about them?" "Practice," it said simply. "Every transition requires preparation. The smaller minds are easier to work with, easier to shift from one state to another. But consciousness like your human consciousness, that requires more delicate handling." I reached the top of the stairs and started backing down, step by careful step. The creature followed, though it seemed to simply flow down the stairs rather than using them in any conventional sense. "You're feeling it now, aren't you?" it asked. "The pull, the desire to understand more, to see more, to become more than what you are." And it was right. Despite my fear, despite every rational thought screaming at me to run, there was something seductive about its offer. The idea of becoming part of something larger, something that existed beyond the normal bounds of human experience. I thought about my life, the monotony of my job, the isolation of my posting, the growing sense that I was wasting my time on things that didn't matter. What if this creature was offering me a chance to be part of something genuinely important? That thought scared me more than anything else that had happened in the past 2 days. "No," I said, as much to myself as to the creature. "No, I'm not interested in whatever you're selling." Its smile faltered for the first time. "You don't understand. This isn't a choice. The process has already begun. You've been exposed to our influence for too long. You've seen our true forms, heard our call. There's no going back to what you were." I'd reached the bottom of the stairs now. The front door was just across the living room, but between me and it stood the circle of animals that had been arranged on the floor. Looking at them now, I noticed something I'd missed before. They weren't all dead. Some of them, the ones closer to the center of the circle, were moving. Barely, just the slightest rise and fall of tiny chests, but they were breathing. And their eyes, when I looked closely, weren't the glassy stare of death but something else, something aware. "They're still alive," I said. "Alive is a limited concept," the creature replied. "They exist in a state between life and death, between one form of being and another. It's quite beautiful, really. They feel no pain, no fear, no hunger except for the hunger we provide them. You're torturing them. We're elevating them. Just as we elevated the Holloways, just as we will elevate you." I was almost to the door now. Through the dirty windows I could see the ring of pale figures waiting outside, but there had to be a way through them, a gap I could exploit if I moved fast enough. "The paper's upstairs," I said, stalling for time while I tried to spot a weakness in their formation. Margaret Holloway. What happened to her? She understood, in the end. The hunger we offered was better than the emptiness she felt without it. She stopped fighting, stopped trying to leave. She became one of our most devoted watchers. She's still alive? She exists. Whether you call that alive or not depends on your perspective. That's when I saw her, standing among the pale figures in the circle, barely distinguishable from them except for the remnants of clothing that clung to her transformed body. She had the same elongated limbs, the same translucent skin, the same empty eye sockets, but something about her posture, the way she held her head, was still recognizably human. She was looking directly at the house, and even without eyes, I could feel her attention focused on me. There was something desperate about her stance, something that suggested she was fighting against whatever had been done to her. As I watched, she raised one impossibly long arm and pointed toward the back of the house. A way out. I have to go, I said to the creature behind me. People will be looking for me. Other rangers, the sheriff's department. When I don't check in, they will find your truck. The creature interrupted. They will assume you had an accident in the woods, or that you simply walked away from a job you didn't enjoy. People disappear in these forests all the time. I'd reached the door now. My hand was on the handle, but I hesitated. Once I opened it, once I stepped outside, there would be no going back. Whatever happened next would determine whether I escaped this place or became another victim of whatever these things were. Last chance, the creature said. Join us willingly, and the transition will be gentle. Fight us, and it will be unpleasant. I looked back at it one final time. In the dim light of the abandoned house, it looked almost beautiful in its alien way. There was something seductive about its offer, something that promised answers to questions I'd never even thought to ask. But then I thought about those animals in the circle, trapped between life and death. I thought about the Holloways, documenting these things for years before finally succumbing to whatever influence they projected. I thought about Margaret Holloway, transformed into something that was no longer quite human but retained enough awareness to try to help me escape. I opened the door and ran. The circle of pale figures immediately began moving, flowing toward me with that same liquid grace I'd seen in the house. But Margaret Holloway had been right there. Was a gap at the back of the formation, a space just wide enough for a desperate man to squeeze through. I sprinted across the clearing, feeling those empty eye sockets tracking my movement. Something brushed against my shoulder as I reached the edge of the circle, cold fingers that left burning trails on my skin even through my shirt. But then I was through, crashing into the forest with no thought for stealth or safety. Behind me the humming started again, but this time it was angry, discordant, the sound of dozens of inhuman voices raised in something that might have been frustration or rage. I ran through the forest without looking back, crashing through underbrush and bouncing off trees in my desperation to get away. Branches tore at my clothes and face, but I didn't slow down until I could see the lights of my cabin through the trees. Only then did I stop to catch my breath and listen for sounds of pursuit. The forest was silent. I made it back to the cabin and immediately started throwing my few possessions into a duffel bag. Whatever those things were, whatever they wanted, I wasn't going to stick around to find out more. I'd file a report with the regional office, tell them there was some kind of dangerous animal activity in the remote sections of the park, let someone else figure out what to do about it. But even as I packed, I could feel something pulling at the back of my mind. A curiosity about what I'd seen, a need to understand more about the creatures and their purpose. Part of me wanted to go back, to learn more about the Holloways and what had happened to them. I fought against that impulse and finished packing. 20 minutes later, I was driving away from the cabin with my headlights cutting through the darkness. In my rearview mirror, I could see pale figures standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me leave. I never went back to that job. I transferred to a different park, then eventually left the ranger service altogether. But sometimes late at night I still think about those creatures and their offer. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I'd let them show me whatever it was they wanted to show me. The hunger they spoke of, I understand it now. It's the need to know, to understand, to be part of something larger than yourself. And sometimes, in the small hours of the morning when sleep won't come, I can feel it growing stronger. I tell myself I'll never go back to those woods, but deep down I know that's a lie. Because once you've seen something that shouldn't exist, once you've been offered a glimpse of what lies beyond the normal world, it's impossible to simply forget and move on. The creatures were right about one thing: understanding changes you, and some changes can never be undone. But I'm still here, still human, still writing this down as a warning to anyone who might find themselves in similar circumstances. Stay away from the remote sections of the East Texas forests. If you see pale figures in the distance, don't investigate, don't try to understand. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some hungers are better left unfed. I'm from a small town in Wisconsin, and I've always been a skeptical guy. I've never believed in ghosts or monsters. I've always been more concerned with fixing my old truck or watching a Packers game. But what happened to me a few years ago at Camp Clearwater made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. It was a warm July day, and I was looking forward to my annual summer trip to Camp Clearwater. I had been going there since I was a kid, first as a camper, then as a junior counselor, and now, at 25, I was returning as a full counselor for the first time. The responsibility felt good, like I was finally stepping into adulthood in a meaningful way. Camp Clearwater was one of those places that felt timeless, frozen in an era when things seemed simpler. The cabins were old but sturdy, built from local pine logs that had weathered decades of Wisconsin summers and winters. The lake was crystal clear, so transparent you could see the sandy bottom 20 feet down. The campfires at night were always a highlight, where stories were told and friendships were forged under a canopy of stars that city kids never got to see. As I drove my pickup truck down the familiar gravel road that led to camp, memories flooded back. The scent of pine needles and lake water hit me as soon as I rolled down the windows. Nothing had changed much in the years since I'd been a camper myself. The same wooden sign, weathered and slightly crooked, welcomed visitors to Camp Clearwater, where memories are made. The same rustic buildings dotted the shoreline, and the same dock stretched out into the pristine water. Mr. Miller met me at the main lodge, just as I remembered him, a gruff but kind man in his 50s with calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes. He had been running the camp for over 2 decades and knew every inch of the place, every trail through the surrounding forest, every hiding spot the kids thought they'd discovered first. "Good to have you back, Ian," he said, gripping my hand in his firm handshake. "You ready for this? Being a counselor's different from being a camper." I assured him I was ready, though a small part of me wondered if that was true. The kids would be arriving the next day, and I'd be responsible for 8 of them in my cabin. It was a weight I felt settling on my shoulders, but it was a good weight, the kind that comes with purpose. We had a decent group of kids that year. Some were locals from the small towns scattered throughout northern Wisconsin, while others came from neighboring states like Minnesota and Iowa. There was Matt, a quiet 12-year-old who always seemed to have his nose buried in a book, even during outdoor activities. He reminded me of myself at that age, more comfortable with stories than with people. Then there was Jenna, a 13-year-old who was always cracking jokes and could make even the shyest kid laugh. The twins, Ryan and Rachel, were 11 and inseparable, always getting into the kind of harmless mischief that kept counselors on their toes but ultimately brought smiles to everyone's faces. The first week went by smoothly, almost deceptively so. We fell into the rhythm of camp life that I remembered so fondly. Morning reveille at 7, breakfast in the main lodge where the smell of bacon and pancakes mixed with the sound of excited chatter. Then came the daily activities: swimming lessons in the clear, cold water of the lake, hiking through the dense forest that surrounded us, arts and crafts in the old cabin that doubled as our creative workshop. I even managed to get the old canoe out on the lake a few times, teaching some of the kids how to paddle properly and sharing stories about the fish that supposedly lurked in the deeper parts of the lake. But then, things started to get weird. It began with small stuff, the kind of things that happen at every summer camp and usually have innocent explanations. A flashlight went missing from Matt's backpack during a night hike. Jenna's favorite hair tie disappeared from her cabin. Ryan's baseball cap vanished from the dining hall between lunch and dinner. At first, we thought it was just the kids playing pranks on each other, typical camp behavior that would sort itself out once the novelty wore off. Mr. Miller wasn't concerned. "Happens every year," he told me when I mentioned it. "Kids forget where they put things, or they're testing boundaries. Give it a few days." But the missing items weren't random pranks. There was something systematic about them, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up even though I couldn't explain why. The items that disappeared were always personal things, objects that the kids had strong attachments to. And they never turned up in the usual places where forgotten items gathered, not in the lost and found box, not under beds or in the corners of activity areas. It was on a Thursday night, exactly 1 week after the kids had arrived, that things took a turn from odd to genuinely unsettling. I was in my cabin, writing in the daily log that all counselors were required to keep, when I heard a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Jenna standing there in her pajamas, her usually bright face pale and drawn with worry. "Ian," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder toward the girls' cabin 50 yards away. "Someone's outside our cabin at night." I frowned, stepping out onto my small porch and looking around the dark campgrounds. The only lights were the soft yellow glows from the cabin windows and the distant security light near the main lodge. "Are you sure? It's probably just one of the other kids sneaking around. You know how Ryan gets when he's planning something." She shook her head firmly. "No, it's not. They're big, like adult big, and they just stand there watching us through the windows. Melissa saw them first 2 nights ago, and last night Sarah saw them too. They think I'm making it up when I tell them we should report it, but I'm not. There's someone out there." The fear in her voice was real, and despite my natural skepticism, I felt a chill run down my spine. Jenna wasn't the type to make up stories for attention. She was practical, level-headed for a 13-year-old, the kind of kid who looked out for the younger ones and kept everyone's spirits up when homesickness hit. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "I'll check it out. But in the meantime, make sure all your cabin doors and windows are locked, and if you see anything else, you come straight to me, understand?" She nodded gratefully and hurried back to her cabin. I watched her go, noting how she kept glancing back at the tree line that bordered the camp. Once she was safely inside, I decided to stay up and keep an eye on the girls' cabin myself. That night, I positioned myself at my cabin window with a clear view of the girls' quarters and the surrounding area. I had a thermos of coffee and a pair of binoculars that Mr. Miller kept in the counselor's supply room for wildlife observation. The rational part of my mind insisted I was probably wasting my time, that I'd spend the night watching nothing more threatening than raccoons or deer. But around midnight, I saw movement in the shadows. At first, it was just a darker patch among the trees that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. I squinted through the binoculars, trying to make out details, but whoever or whatever it was stayed just outside the circle of light cast by the security lamps. The movement was deliberate, patient, as if the figure knew exactly where the shadows fell and how to use them. For nearly an hour, I watched this shadow dance. The figure would move closer to the girls' cabin, pause for several minutes, then retreat back into the deeper darkness of the forest. There was something profoundly unsettling about the pattern, like a predator testing the defenses of its prey. My hands grew slick with sweat as I gripped the binoculars, and I found myself holding my breath during the figure's closest approaches to the cabin. Around 1 a.m, the figure finally disappeared completely. I waited another hour before I was convinced it was gone, then spent the rest of the night in an uneasy doze, starting awake at every small sound from outside. The next morning I mentioned what I'd seen to Mr. Miller during our daily check-in meeting. I tried to keep my tone casual, not wanting to seem like I was overreacting, but also needing to share what I'd witnessed. "I'm sure it's nothing, Ian," he said, but I noticed he didn't quite meet my eyes when he spoke. "Probably just a deer or maybe a bear checking out the garbage area. You know how curious they get this time of year." His explanation should have been reassuring, but something about his body language suggested he wasn't as unconcerned as he wanted me to believe. He kept fidgeting with his coffee cup, and his usual confident demeanor seemed strained. The kids were increasingly spooked as the days went on. They started talking in hushed groups during meals, their usual boisterous energy replaced by nervous glances toward the windows and frequent requests to use the bathroom in pairs. They said they'd seen a man in the woods during their supervised activities, always at a distance, never coming close enough to be clearly identified, but always there, watching. Matt, normally absorbed in his books, had trouble concentrating during reading time. "It feels like when you're reading a scary story," he told me, "except you can't close the book and make it stop." The twins, Ryan and Rachel, who usually competed to see who could come up with the most elaborate pranks, had become clingy and subdued. They stuck close to the counselors during outdoor activities and requested to sleep in beds next to each other rather than on opposite sides of their cabin as they'd originally chosen. Even Jenna, with her usual infectious humor, seemed subdued. Her jokes became forced, and I caught her staring off into the forest with an expression I'd never seen on her young face, a mixture of fear and terrible understanding, as if she'd recognized something that children shouldn't have to recognize. I decided I needed to take a more active approach. During the afternoon rest period, when the kids were required to stay in their cabins for quiet time, I ventured into the forest surrounding Camp Clearwater to investigate. The woods were dense, filled with tall pines and thick underbrush that had grown wild over decades. Shafts of sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a patchwork of light and shadow that played tricks on the eyes. I'd been hiking these trails since I was 8 years old, but somehow they felt different now, less familiar. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep. Every rustle of leaves in the breeze could have been someone moving through the undergrowth. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I was being observed. About half a mile from the main camp, where the forest began to thicken and the official trails petered out into deer paths, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In a small clearing that I'd never noticed during all my years at the camp, I found an old dilapidated cabin. The structure looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The roof sagged under the weight of fallen branches and accumulated debris. The windows were either broken or so dirty they were opaque. Vines had begun to climb the walls, and the wooden steps leading to the front door were rotted and partially collapsed. But despite its obviously abandoned state, there were signs that someone had been there recently. The weeds around the entrance had been trampled down, creating a clear path to the door. Some of the larger branches blocking the windows had been moved aside. Fresh footprints in the soft earth around the cabin were clearly visible, too large to belong to any of the children, but definitely human. Curiosity got the better of my growing unease, and I pushed open the creaky door. The hinges protested with a sound like a dying animal, and I had to put my shoulder against the warped wood to force it open wide enough to enter. Inside, the air was thick and musty, filled with the smell of decay and something else, something organic and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, but like outside, there were clear signs that someone had been using this space. Footprints crisscrossed the floor, and areas had been swept clean, creating a patchwork of disturbance in the dust. Old tools were scattered around the single-room, rusty saws, hammers with rotted handles, and what looked like the remains of a toolbox that had long since fallen apart. In the corner sat a rusty metal bed frame, stripped of its mattress, with coils of wire springs protruding at odd angles. But what really caught my attention was the makeshift table constructed from old wooden planks balanced on sawhorses. On this improvised surface, arranged with an almost ritualistic precision, was a collection of items that made my stomach turn. There were the missing objects from Camp Matt's flashlight, Jenna's hair tie, Ryan's baseball cap, and dozens of other small personal items that I recognized from previous weeks and probably previous summers. But there were older things too, items that looked like they'd been collected over years or even decades. Faded baseball cards, a child's sneaker with rotted laces, a tarnished bracelet, a small stuffed animal that had been worn down to the nub by countless childhood hugs. As I stared at this grotesque collection, something caught my eye that made my heart nearly stop. Partially hidden beneath a moldy piece of fabric was a pile of old photographs. With trembling hands, I picked up the top one and felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature in the abandoned cabin. The photograph was faded and yellowed with age, but the image was still clear. It showed a group of children, probably from the 1950s based on their clothing and the quality of the photo, standing in front of a cabin that I recognized as one of the current camp buildings. They were smiling, typical summer camp poses, but what drew my attention was the man standing behind them. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly out of the photograph with an intensity that was deeply disturbing. His face was sharp and angular, almost skeletal, and there was something wrong about his smile, too wide, too knowing, as if he was privy to a joke that no one else understood. His presence seemed to overshadow the children in the photo, making them appear small and vulnerable, almost like offerings. I quickly shuffled through the other photographs, and my horror grew with each image. They spanned decades, showing different groups of children from different eras, but always with the same tall, gaunt man hovering in the background. In some photos, he was barely visible, a shadowy figure at the edge of the frame. In others, he stood prominently behind the children, his hands resting on their shoulders in a gesture that should have seemed protective but instead felt predatory. The most recent photograph in the pile made me drop the entire collection. It showed a group of children I recognized, campers from just a few years ago, kids I remembered from my time as a junior counselor. And standing behind them, unchanged by the passage of time, was the same gaunt man with the same hollow eyes and disturbing smile. I quickly gathered up the photographs, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them properly, and fled the cabin. As I ran back toward camp, crashing through the underbrush and ignoring the branches that tore at my clothes and skin, I could feel eyes watching me from the depths of the forest. But when I stopped and turned around, gasping for breath, there was nothing there but trees and shadows. That evening I found Mr. Miller in his office, a small room in the main lodge filled with decades of camp memorabilia and administrative paperwork. He was reviewing activity schedules for the following week, but I could see the stress lines around his eyes had deepened since our conversation that morning. "I need to talk to you about something," I said, closing the door behind me and taking a seat across from his cluttered desk. "I found something in the woods today, an old cabin." Mr. Miller's pen stopped moving across the paper. He didn't look up immediately, but I saw his shoulders tense. When he finally raised his eyes to meet mine, I saw something there I'd never seen before. Fear. "Oh, that old place," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "It used to be part of the camp, but we stopped using it years ago. Too many bad memories." The way he said it made my skin crawl. There was weight behind those words, a history that he clearly didn't want to discuss. But I pressed on, pulling the photographs from my jacket pocket and spreading them across his desk. "What do you mean by bad memories?" I asked. "And who is this man in all these pictures?" Mr. Miller's face went pale as he looked at the photographs. His hands, usually so steady and capable, began to tremble as he picked up first one image, then another. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at the pictures with an expression of profound horror and what might have been guilt. "Where did you find these?" he whispered. "In the cabin. Along with this, I pulled out one of the items I'd taken from the collection, Matt's missing flashlight, and about 30 other things that have gone missing from camp over the years, maybe decades." Mr. Miller slumped back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 50-plus years and then some. He rubbed his face with both hands, a gesture of exhaustion and defeat. "His name was Thomas Ashford," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He worked here as a maintenance man back in the late 50s. Quiet guy, kept to himself, always volunteering to help with the kids' activities. Everyone thought he was just being helpful." He paused, staring at one of the photographs, the oldest one, showing children from what must have been the 1950s. Back then, we didn't have the same awareness about certain types of people and what they might do to children. Background checks weren't standard. References were often just word of mouth. Thomas seemed harmless enough, and he was good with repairs, so we kept him on staff for 3 summers. My stomach was beginning to turn as I realized where this story was heading. During his 3rd summer, 1959, I think it was, a camper went missing. A boy named David Chen, 8 years old. One night he was in his bunk, and the next morning his bed was empty. We searched for days, weeks, brought in state police, search and rescue teams, volunteers from all the surrounding towns, never found so much as a trace of him. Mr. Miller picked up the newest photograph, the one showing kids from just a few years ago. The thing is, Thomas disappeared that same night, never showed up for work the next day, and when we went to check on him, his quarters were empty. No note, no explanation, just gone. The police questioned everyone, but without evidence, they couldn't prove anything. The case went cold, the camp almost shut down, and eventually people forgot. David Chen became just another missing child statistic. "But you didn't forget," I said, studying his face. He shook his head slowly. "I was just a junior counselor then, 22 years old and scared out of my mind. But I remember things. I remember how Thomas used to watch the kids during activities, how he always seemed to know which children were shy or had trouble making friends. I remember finding him in places he shouldn't have been, always with a reasonable explanation for being there. and I remember the look in his eyes sometimes when he thought no one was watching, hungry, calculating. "Mr. Miller," I said carefully, "Thomas Ashford would be in his 80s or 90s by now, if he's even still alive. The man I saw watching our cabins last night, the figure the kids have been seeing." "I know," he interrupted. "I know it doesn't make sense. But I've been running this camp for 23 years and I've seen him too. Not often, maybe once or twice each summer, always at a distance, always in the shadows. He hasn't aged a day since 1959. The rational part of my mind was screaming that this was impossible, that there had to be another explanation. But the photographs in front of me told a different story. The same man, unchanged by the passage of decades, appearing in pictures spanning from the 1950s to just a few years ago. "There's more," Mr. Miller continued, his voice growing even quieter. "Other children have gone missing over the years. Not from our camp, we've been very careful, very vigilant, but from other camps in the region, from families camping in the state forests. Always children between 8 and 13 years old. Always during the summer months. The disappearances are spread out enough, different jurisdictions, different years, that no one's connected them to a pattern. But I've been keeping track." He pulled out a file folder from his desk drawer, and I saw that it was thick with newspaper clippings, police reports, and handwritten notes. Decades of research into missing children cases across northern Wisconsin and the surrounding states. 19 children in 66 years, he said, all fitting the same profile, all vanishing without a trace during summer camping season. And in half the cases, witnesses reported seeing a tall, gaunt man in the area shortly before the disappearance. The weight of what he was telling me settled over me like a suffocating blanket. "Why haven't you gone to the police with this?" "With what? 60-year-old photographs and a crazy story about a man who doesn't age? They'd think I was having a breakdown. Besides, what could they do? We've tried increasing security, installing better lighting, doing more frequent head counts. But he's patient. He waits. And somehow, he always finds a way." As if summoned by our conversation, a scream pierced the evening air from outside. Both Mr. Miller and I jumped up from our chairs, the photographs scattering to the floor. The scream came again, higher and more desperate this time, and I recognized the voice. It was Jenna. We ran out of the lodge and toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from the direction of the girls' cabin. As we got closer, I could see children gathered outside their buildings, counselors trying to calm them while looking around frantically for the source of the disturbance. "What happened?" Mr. Miller shouted to Rebecca, one of the other counselors. "It's the twins," she called back, her face pale in the security lighting. "Ryan and Rachel. Their beds are empty, and Jenna saw someone carrying them toward the forest." My blood turned to ice. I looked at Mr. Miller, and I could see my own horror reflected in his face. After 66 years and 19 missing children, Thomas Ashford had finally returned to Camp Clearwater to finish what he'd started. "Get all the children into the main lodge." Mr. Miller ordered the other counselors. "Lock the doors. Don't let anyone in or out unless it's me or Ian. Call the police and tell them we have a child abduction in progress." He turned to me, his eyes hard with determination and something else he resolved that came from carrying guilt for too many years. "We're going after them," he said. "I should have ended this decades ago." Mr. Miller and I grabbed heavy-duty flashlights and headed into the forest, following what we hoped was the trail that Thomas Ashford had taken with Ryan and Rachel. The darkness seemed to press in around us, and every shadow could have been hiding our quarry or another trap entirely. The trail was easier to follow than I'd expected. In his haste, or perhaps his confidence, Ashford had made little effort to cover his tracks. Broken branches, trampled undergrowth, and occasional footprints in the soft earth led us deeper into the woods than I'd ever gone, even during my childhood explorations of the area. "He's heading for the old cabin," Mr. Miller said grimly as we pushed through a particularly thick stand of pine trees. "I should have burned that place down years ago." The forest seemed to grow denser and more hostile the further we went. Low-hanging branches caught at our clothes and hair, roots tried to trip us with every step, and the beam of our flashlights seemed to be swallowed by the darkness just a few feet ahead of us. But worst of all was the silence. No night birds, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, no wind through the trees. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see how this night would end. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, we reached the clearing where the abandoned cabin sat. Light flickered in the windows, the warm, dancing glow of candles or an oil lamp. The sight was somehow more terrifying than if the building had been dark. It suggested preparation, planning, ritual. "We need to be smart about this," Mr. Miller whispered as we crouched at the edge of the tree line. "He's had them for at least 30 minutes. If we go charging in there and spook him." He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew what happened to children who were alone with Thomas Ashford for too long. "There's only one door," I observed, studying the cabin's layout. "If we can get around to the back, maybe we can find a window to look through, see what we're dealing with." Mr. Miller nodded, and we began to work our way around the perimeter of the clearing, staying in the shadows of the trees. The back of the cabin had 2 windows, both filthy and partially boarded up, but there were gaps in the boards that we could peer through. What I saw inside made my stomach lurch. The cabin's interior was lit by dozens of candles arranged around the room, their flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. The makeshift table I'd seen earlier had been cleared of its collection of stolen objects, and in their place were tools, ropes, knives, and other implements that I didn't want to think about the purpose of. Ryan and Rachel sat in the corner, bound and gagged but apparently unharmed. Their eyes were wide with terror, but they were alert and conscious. Between them and us stood Thomas Ashford, and seeing him clearly for the first time was worse than any of the photographs had prepared me for. He was exactly as tall and gaunt as he'd appeared in the pictures, but the decades had done something to him that went beyond simple aging. His skin had a waxy, translucent quality, stretched tight over sharp bones. His hair was thin and white, hanging in lank strands around his hollow face. But his eyes were the worst part. They burned with an intensity that was absolutely inhuman, filled with a hunger that made me understand why children had nightmares about the monster under the bed. He was moving around the cabin with a purpose that suggested ritual, preparation for something that I knew we couldn't allow to happen. As we watched, he approached a corner of the room that had been hidden from my view during my earlier visit and began dragging something into the light. It was a large burlap sack, and from the way he handled it, it was heavy. When he upended it in the center of the room, dozens of small objects spilled out, more personal items taken from children over the decades, but also other things. Small bones, yellowed with age, teeth, locks of hair tied with rotting ribbons. Mr. Miller grabbed my arm so tightly I thought he might break it. When I looked at his face, I saw tears streaming down his cheeks. "David Chen," he whispered, "and all the others." Thomas Ashford began to arrange the contents of the sack in a circle around Ryan and Rachel, humming tunelessly to himself as he worked. Whatever he was planning, we were running out of time to stop it. "We go in fast and hard," Mr. Miller said, his voice steadier than I would have expected. "I'll go through the front door, make noise, try to draw his attention. You come through that window. It's rotted enough that you should be able to break through the boards. Get to the kids and get them out. What about you?" His smile was grim and determined. "I've been carrying the guilt of David Chen's disappearance for 23 years. Tonight that ends." Before I could argue or suggest an alternative plan, Mr. Miller was moving. I heard him crash through the front door with a sound like breaking thunder, shouting at the top of his lungs. Through the window, I saw Thomas Ashford spin toward the sound, his face twisted with rage at having his ritual interrupted. I didn't waste time. I threw my shoulder against the rotted boards covering the back window, and they gave way with a satisfying crack. I tumbled through the opening, rolled to my feet, and ran toward Ryan and Rachel. The twins' eyes went wide when they saw me, but whether from relief or fear I couldn't tell. I pulled out my pocket knife and began cutting through their bonds, my hands shaking so badly I was afraid I'd cut them instead of the ropes. Behind me I could hear Mr. Miller and Thomas Ashford fighting. There were sounds of impact, crashing furniture, and Mr. Miller's voice shouting things that were lost in the chaos. But Thomas Ashford wasn't making any sound at all, which was somehow more frightening than if he'd been screaming. I got Ryan free first and shoved him toward the broken window. "Go, run back to camp and get help." Ryan hesitated, looking at his sister, but I was already working on Rachel's bonds. "I'll get her out, just go." As Ryan disappeared through the window, I finally got Rachel's ropes cut. She ripped the gag from her mouth and gasped. He said he was going to make us like the others. "Not tonight," I said firmly, lifting her toward the window. "Climb through and follow your brother." Just as Rachel disappeared through the opening, something crashed into me from behind, sending me sprawling across the floor. I rolled over to see Thomas Ashford standing over me, and for the first time, I got a clear look at his face up close. It was worse than anything I could have imagined. His skin wasn't just pale, it was the color of something that had been dead for a long time. His eyes weren't just hollow, they were black pits that seemed to absorb the candlelight rather than reflecting it. And when he smiled, I saw that his teeth were sharp, filed to points, stained with things I didn't want to think about. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, and his voice was like the sound of wind through a graveyard. "But now that you have, you can take their place." I looked around frantically for Mr. Miller and saw him lying motionless near the overturned table, blood pooling beneath his head. Whether he was unconscious or worse, I couldn't tell, but he wasn't going to be able to help me. Thomas Ashford reached down and grabbed me by the throat with one impossibly strong hand, lifting me off the ground as if I weighed nothing. His fingers were like ice, and where they touched my skin I felt a numbing cold that spread through my entire body. 66 years I've been waiting," he whispered, his breath like the smell of an open grave. 66 years of taking what I could find, when what I really wanted was to come home, to finish what I started here. Black spots were dancing at the edges of my vision, but I managed to reach into my pocket and pull out my knife. With the last of my strength, I drove the blade into his wrist. Thomas Ashford shrieked the first sound I'd heard him make that seemed remotely human and dropped me. I fell to the floor, gasping for air, but I forced myself to roll away from him and get to my feet. The knife was still embedded in his wrist, but instead of blood, a thick, black substance was oozing from the wound. The smell that rose from it was indescribable, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur and something else that made my primitive brain scream with terror. "You cannot kill what is already dead," Thomas Ashford said, pulling the knife from his wrist with a wet, sucking sound. "But you can join the others." He advanced on me again, but this time I was ready. I grabbed one of the heavy candles from the makeshift table and hurled it at him. The flame caught his clothing, and suddenly he was burning not with normal fire, but with flames that burned blue and green and threw off waves of heat that made the air shimmer. Thomas Ashford screamed again, but this time it wasn't human at all. It was the sound of something ancient and evil being forced back into whatever pit it had crawled out of. He staggered around the cabin, crashing into the walls, setting everything he touched ablaze with that unnatural fire. I ran to Mr. Miller and checked for a pulse. He was alive but unconscious, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead. I managed to get him over my shoulder in a fireman's carry and staggered toward the front door as the cabin began to burn in earnest around us. The last thing I saw before we escaped into the night was Thomas Ashford, fully engulfed in those impossible flames, still reaching toward us with burning fingers even as his body crumbled to ash. The fire department arrived 20 minutes after Ryan reached camp and raised the alarm, but by then there was nothing left of the cabin except a pile of smoldering ash and the twisted remains of the metal bed frame. The paramedics checked over Mr. Miller, Ryan, Rachel, and me, treating us for smoke inhalation and minor cuts and bruises, but physically we were all going to be fine. Psychologically was another matter entirely. The police investigation was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. They found the remains of the cabin and evidence that it had been occupied recently, but no trace of Thomas Ashford, not even bones or teeth, which should have survived even the intense fire that had consumed the structure. The collection of personal items that had been in the cabin was completely destroyed, along with any evidence that might have proven our story about decades of missing children. Mr. Miller spent 3 days in the hospital for observation, mostly because the doctors were concerned about his head injury. When he was released, we sat together on the dock at Camp Clearwater and watched the morning sun rise over the lake that had been such a source of peace for both of us over the years. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time before answering. "I think Thomas Ashford is gone, yes. But whether that thing was really Thomas Ashford or just something wearing his shape, I honestly don't know. All I know is that after 23 years of watching shadows and jumping at every strange sound, I felt something change last night. Like a weight I'd been carrying was finally lifted. The camp was shut down for the rest of the season while the investigation continued. The parents of all the children were contacted and given a carefully edited version of events an intruder on the grounds who had been driven off, with no mention of missing children from decades past or the supernatural aspects of what we'd experienced. Ryan and Rachel handled the trauma better than anyone expected. Children are remarkably resilient, and having each other to lean on helped them process what they'd been through. They both insisted that while they'd been terrified, they'd never doubted that someone would come for them. Matt asked me to recommend some books about real-life monsters when his parents came to pick him up. I suggested he stick to fiction for a while. Jenna's parents wanted to press charges against someone, anyone, for what their daughter had endured, but there was no one to charge. The man who had terrorized us was gone in a way that made legal proceedings impossible. As for me, I spent the rest of that summer trying to process what I'd experienced. I'd always been a skeptical person, someone who believed in logical explanations and rational solutions to problems. What happened at Camp Clearwater challenged everything I thought I knew about the world. I moved to Milwaukee that fall, taking a job with a construction company that specialized in commercial buildings work that kept me in the city, around lots of people, far from dark forests and shadowy cabins. I tried to put the whole thing behind me and return to my normal life of fixing trucks and watching Packers games. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I still see those hollow, burning eyes staring at me from the darkness. I still hear that voice like wind through a graveyard, promising that death is not the end for some things. And sometimes I wonder if we really destroyed Thomas Ashford that night, or if we just sent him somewhere else to wait for another opportunity. I've kept in touch with Mr. Miller over the years. He eventually reopened Camp Clearwater, but with significant changes: better security, more counselors, and a strict policy that no child is ever alone, even for a moment. He's also had the surrounding forest extensively cleared, removing the dense undergrowth and isolated areas where something might hide. Prevention is better than cure, he told me during one of our annual phone calls. If there are other things like Thomas Ashford out there, I'm going to make sure they find easier hunting grounds than my camp. Ryan and Rachel visit him sometimes during the summer. They're teenagers now, and Rachel has expressed interest in becoming a counselor herself when she's old enough. Their resilience continues to amaze me. Matt became a writer, specializing in what he calls reality-based horror stories that explore the dark things that can happen in the real world without requiring supernatural explanations. He sent me his first published story last year, and while it was fiction, I recognized elements of our experiences at Camp Clearwater woven throughout the narrative. Jenna went on to become a social worker, specializing in helping children who have been through traumatic experiences. She credits what happened to us at camp with showing her that even in the darkest situations, people can take care of each other and find ways to survive. As for Camp Clearwater itself, it continues to operate every summer, serving new generations of children who come to swim in the crystal-clear lake and sit around campfires under the Wisconsin stars. The memories that place holds for me are complicated now, a mixture of the innocent joy of childhood summers and the terrible knowledge of what evil can hide in familiar places. But I'm glad it's still there. I'm glad that other children get to experience the magic of that place, even if they'll never know how close it came to being lost forever. And I'm glad that there are people like Mr. Miller who are willing to stand guard against the darkness, even when the cost of that vigilance is higher than anyone should have to pay. Sometimes I drive up to northern Wisconsin during the summer, not to visit the camp, but just to park along the highway and look out over the lake from a distance. The water is still crystal clear, the forest is still green and deep, and somewhere in that peaceful scene, children are learning to canoe and roast marshmallows and tell stories that will shape their memories for the rest of their lives. And if sometimes those stories are about monsters and things that go bump in the night, well, maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. Because sometimes the monsters are real, and sometimes the only thing standing between them and the innocent is someone who's willing to believe in both the darkness and the light. I'm still a skeptical guy from a small town in Wisconsin. I still worry more about fixing my truck than about supernatural threats. But what happened to me at Camp Clearwater taught me that skepticism and vigilance aren't mutually exclusive. You can believe in rational explanations for most things, while still being prepared for the few things that defy rational explanation entirely. And you can spend your life watching football games and working on engines, while still carrying the knowledge that there are dark places in the world where evil waits patiently for its chance to strike. The trick is not letting that knowledge paralyze you, but instead letting it remind you to pay attention, to take care of each other, and to never assume that the shadows are empty just because you can't see what's hiding in them. That's the real lesson I learned during those terrifying nights at Camp Clearwater. Not that monsters exist, though they do, but that ordinary people have the capacity to face extraordinary evil and protect the things that matter most. And sometimes, if you're brave enough and lucky enough, you can even win. My name is Atsadi Adair, and I come from a line of Cherokee trackers that stretches back 7 generations before the Trail of Tears. My great-great-grandfather could find a lost soul in a blizzard, using nothing but bent grass and the whisper of wind through pine needles. That gift, diluted but not destroyed by time and intermarriage, flows through my veins like the mountain streams that carved these ancient valleys. I've been a park ranger in the Uwharrie National Forest for 8 years now, and in that time I've seen things that would make most people pack up their camping gear and never look back. But when your bloodline has survived forced relocation, smallpox, and the systematic destruction of a way of life, you learn that the world holds darkness in every shadow when, sometimes, you're the only thing standing between that darkness and innocent people. The old Cherokee word for what I do is Navi Unagathe. White man's version would be Pathfinder, but that doesn't capture the spiritual weight of the responsibility. We were always the ones who ventured into the deep woods, who knew which plants could heal and which could kill, who understood that the forest was alive in ways that transcended simple biology. My grandmother, before she passed, used to tell me stories that my parents dismissed as folklore. Stories about the Fook and the Kekle Kudle creatures that walked upright like men but were definitely not human. She described them in whispered Cherokee, her weathered hands moving in the ancient gestures that gave weight to words. Most people today would call these creatures Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but my grandmother knew better. She knew they were older than names, older than the Cherokee themselves. Atsadi, she would say, using my Cherokee name rather than the Adam that appeared on my birth certificate. The forest keeps its own counsel. When people go missing in the deep woods, sometimes they're lost to more than just poor navigation. I thought about those words on this particular October morning as I stood over the abandoned campsite that would change everything. The Coleman family, 2 parents, teenage daughter, and 8-year-old son had been reported missing by the campground host after they failed to check out. Their tent was still standing, sleeping bags rolled neat as military bunks, but their hiking boots were gone. So were they. The tracks led north into the deepest part of the Uwharrie, where the old growth still stood and the canopy grew so thick that even noon looked like twilight. I'd found dozens of missing campers over the years, usually dehydrated and embarrassed about wandering off trail. But something about this scene felt different. The forest was too quiet. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. I knelt beside the fire ring, running my fingers through the cold ashes. The Cherokee in me could read stories in the way wood burned, in the patterns ash made when it fell. This fire had been extinguished suddenly, not banked for the night, but smothered. The logs were charred on one side, raw on the other. Someone had been in a hurry. The first set of footprints was easy enough to follow. Size 11 hiking boots, probably the father, moving quickly but with purpose. Then size 8 women's boots, and 2 smaller set sneakers with distinctive tread patterns. They were staying together, which was good. But after about 50 yards, something changed. The footprints began to weave erratically, as if the family had become disoriented or afraid. Then I found the first print that made the hair on my neck stand up. A barefoot impression in the soft earth, but wrong somehow. Too large, too deep, with toes that were longer than any humans should be. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. When the Kekle Kudle hunts, it leaves signs for those who know how to read them. I radioed back to the station. Base, this is Ranger Adair. I'm following the Coleman family trail about half a mile north of Campsite 12, requesting additional SAR personnel and, possibly the K9 unit. The radio crackled. Copy, Atsadi, how does it look? I stared at the massive footprint, easily 17 inches long and 6 inches wide at the ball of the foot. Hard to say, Tom, but I'm going to need backup. As I waited for the search team, I followed the tracks deeper into the forest. The Cherokee part of my training told me to notice everything. The way certain branches were broken at precisely 8 feet off the ground, the musky smell that lingered in the air like wet fur, and something else. Something that reminded me of old caves and deep places where sunlight never reached. The human footprints were becoming more frantic now, scattered and stumbling. But the massive barefoot tracks remained steady, purposeful. Whatever was making them knew exactly where it was going. I found the first piece of clothing about 200 yards further north, a small Batman t-shirt, size 8, torn but not bloody. I bagged it as evidence, but my hands were shaking. The 8-year-old boy, Jimmy Coleman, had been wearing that shirt in the family photo his parents had provided. The trees around me seemed to lean inward, and for a moment I felt like that young Cherokee boy listening to his grandmother's stories by firelight. The forest was watching, waiting. Something was moving through the deep woods, and it knew I was following. I touched the medicine pouch that my grandmother had given me before she died, a small leather bag containing sacred tobacco, a piece of quartz, and a tooth from the last wolf killed in these mountains. The old ways said that such things could offer protection, could help a person see clearly when the world became clouded with fear. The sun was setting now, painting the forest floor in shades of red and gold. In 3 hours it would be full dark, and whatever had taken the Coleman family would have the advantage of its natural habitat. But I couldn't wait for morning. I couldn't abandon them to whatever moved through these woods after midnight. I checked my radio one more time, then continued north, following footprints and broken branches deeper into a forest that my ancestors had known as both sanctuary and hunting ground. The Cherokee word for courage is galvladit doesn't mean the absence of fear, but rather the decision to act despite fear. As darkness began to fall around me, I understood that I was about to need every ounce of galvladi that 7 generations of Cherokee blood could provide. The search team arrived just as the last light was fading from the sky. 3 other rangers, including my partner Jake Morrisona, good man but one who saw the forest as a collection of trees rather than a living entity, and Deputy Sheriff Maria Santos, who'd grown up in these mountains and understood that some stories weren't just stories. "What we got, Atsadi?" Jake asked, adjusting his headlamp and checking his GPS unit. Technology was Jake's security blanket, his way of imposing order on a wilderness that resisted order by its very nature. I showed them the prints, the torn shirt, the broken branches 8 feet off the ground. Jake immediately started talking about bears, maybe a homeless individual camping illegally in the deep woods. Maria just nodded and checked her sidearm. She'd heard the old stories too. "Tracks are heading north toward Devil's Backbone Ridge," I said, using the official name for what my grandmother had called Niviyivwi Ustithe, place of dark spirits. "They've got maybe a 4-hour head start, but they're moving slow. The kids are slowing them down. Or whatever's hurting them wants them to move slow," Maria said quietly. Jake looked between us like we'd started speaking in tongues. "Hurting them? Come on, guys. It's probably just a confused family that got turned around in the dark." But as we began following the trail north, even Jake's rational worldview started to crack. The massive footprints were impossible to ignore, too large and too consistently shaped to be anything explainable. The smell grew stronger too, that mixture of wet fur and something ancient, something that belonged to caves and deep places. About a mile into the pursuit, we found the second piece of evidence, a woman's hiking boot, badly torn, with claw marks scored deep into the leather. 4 parallel gouges, each one precisely spaced. "Jesus," Jake whispered, running his fingers along the marks. "What the hell has claws like that?" I knelt beside the boot, examining the marks more closely. My grandmother had taught me to read sign the way other people read books, to see the story told by broken things. These weren't random slashes, they were deliberate, controlled. Whatever made them had been careful not to harm the foot inside the boot. "It's playing with them," I said, the realization hitting me like cold water. "Hurting them, like Maria said, but not to kill them, not yet." "Playing with them toward what?" Maria asked. I looked north toward Devil's Backbone Ridge, where the trees grew so thick that our flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. Cherokee legend spoke of places in the deep woods where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where spirits could cross over and things that should stay hidden could walk openly. "There's something up there," I said, "something old. My grandmother used to tell stories." "Atsadi," Jake interrupted, "I respect your heritage, but we need to focus on facts here. A family of 4 is missing, and we need to find them before hypothermia or dehydration kills them." He was right, of course. But as we continued north, following the increasingly erratic human footprints and the steady, purposeful tracks of whatever pursued them, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into something larger than a simple search and rescue operation. The forest around us had gone completely silent. No owls, no insects, not even the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was the kind of silence that my ancestors would have recognized as a warning, the silence that comes when predators move through territory that every other living thing knows to avoid. About 2 miles from the original campsite, we found evidence of a struggle. Broken branches, torn vegetation, and scuff marks in the earth suggested that someone had fallen or been knocked down. There was no blood, but there was something else, a handprint pressed into the soft mud beside a fallen log. I measured it with my hand. Mine is fairly large, but this print dwarfed it. The fingers were longer than any human's, with what looked like thick, blunt nails rather than claws. The thumb was positioned differently too, suggesting a grip strength that could easily overpower any human. "They're not alone anymore," I said, studying the print. "Whatever took them, it's gotten closer." Maria's radio crackled with static and distant voice. Other search teams, helicopter pilots, coordination chatter. But here in the deep woods, we might as well have been alone on an alien planet. The normal world of emergency response and rational explanations felt very far away. We pressed on, our flashlight beams cutting narrow tunnels through darkness that seemed almost solid. The trail was easier to follow now. The human footprints showed clear signs of exhaustion and fear, while the larger tracks remained steady and confident. It was Jake who first heard the sound. "Wait," he said, holding up his hand for silence. "Did you hear that?" We stopped, listening. At first, there was only the silence that had followed us for the past hour. Then, carried on the night air from somewhere ahead, came a sound that raised the hair on every part of my body, a low rhythmic vocalization that was almost like singing, but not quite human. The Cherokee word for it was Galvquothith death song, the sound spirits made when they were calling the living to join them. But this wasn't a spirit. This was something physical, something that left 17-inch footprints and could tear hiking boots like paper. "There," Maria whispered, pointing northeast. "Maybe half a mile." The sound came again, closer this time. It had a musical quality, but underneath the melody was something that spoke to the most primitive parts of the human brain, the parts that remembered when our ancestors huddled around fires and feared the things that moved in darkness beyond the light. "We're going to need to be very quiet from here," I said, checking my radio one more time. The signal was weak this far into the wilderness, but I managed to get through to base. "Tom, this is Atsadi. We're about 3 miles north of the original site. Still tracking, but we're going to go radio silent for a while." "Copy. Be careful out there." As we moved toward the sound, I found myself thinking about my grandmother's stories again. She'd told me that the Kekle Kudle weren't evil in the way humans understood evil. They were something older, something that followed different rules. They were protectors of the deep woods, guardians of places that humans weren't meant to go. But they were also hunters. The vegetation around us was changing as we climbed toward Devil's Backbone Ridge. The trees were older here, larger, with trunks so wide that our flashlights couldn't illuminate their full circumference. Moss hung from the branches like ancient curtains, and the air itself felt thicker, older. Then Jake's light caught something that made all of us freeze. Fresh scratches on a massive oak tree, carved deep into the bark about 9 feet off the ground. They weren't random, they formed a pattern, almost like symbols or writing. "Territorial markings," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that's what they were. There was something deliberate about the pattern, something that suggested intelligence rather than simple animal behavior. The singing sound came again, much closer now, and this time we could hear something else underneath it. Human voices, frightened and exhausted, but alive. The Coleman family was somewhere ahead of us in the darkness, in the territory of something that could carve symbols 9 feet off the ground and sing death songs in the night. We were close now, close to answers, close to the family we'd come to rescue, close to something that my grandmother's stories had prepared me for, but that no amount of preparation could make less terrifying. The human voices grew clearer as we approached the ridge. A woman sobbing quietly, a man's voice trying to offer comfort, and the frightened whimpers of children. They were alive, all 4 of them, but they sounded exhausted and terrified. The singing had stopped. We moved through the undergrowth as quietly as possible, using Cherokee tracking techniques my grandfather had taught me, placing each foot carefully, testing the ground before committing weight, breathing in rhythm with the forest itself. Maria understood the necessity of silence. Jake, to his credit, followed our lead despite his obvious skepticism about what we were tracking. About 50 yards from the voices, I signaled for the others to stop. Through the massive tree trunks, I could see the flicker of a small fire. But there was something wrong with the scene. The fire was too perfect, too well constructed for a family that had been running in terror through the woods for hours. I crept closer, using a fallen log for cover, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The Coleman family sat around the carefully constructed fire, but they weren't alone. Standing just outside the circle of light, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure that my rational mind wanted to dismiss as a trick of darkness and imagination. But my Cherokee blood recognized it immediately. The creature stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hung nearly to its knees, and its face, what I could see of it in the shifting firelight, was a disturbing mixture of human and something far older. The crackle, the keeper of the deep woods. But this wasn't the mindless beast that modern mythology portrayed. This was something intelligent, something that had built the fire and arranged the scene with deliberate care. The family sat unnaturally still, their eyes wide with terror but also with something else, a strange, glazed expression that suggested they weren't entirely in control of their actions. The creature was humming again, that low rhythmic vocalization that seemed to vibrate in my bones, and as it hummed, the family swayed slightly, as if responding to music only they could fully hear. I'd heard stories like this from my grandmother's stories about the old ones who could sing people into compliance, who could make humans follow them deep into the woods where they would never be found. The Cherokee word for it was muigaruhaith, walking sleep, the state between consciousness and dreams where the will became malleable. The creature stepped closer to the fire, and in the improved light, I could see details that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Its face was undeniably intelligent, ancient eyes that held knowledge and sadness and something that might have been loneliness. Its hands were massive but dexterous, capable of the precise movements required to build a fire or carve symbols into tree bark. This wasn't a monster. This was something older than monsters, something that remembered when the Cherokee themselves were newcomers to these mountains. But it had taken a family, was holding them against their will, and that made it my problem regardless of its ancient claim to these woods. I eased back to where Maria and Jake waited. Jake's face was pale in the dim light from our shielded flashlight. She'd clearly seen enough to shatter his rational worldview completely. 4 people, sitting around a fire, I whispered. They appear unharmed, but influenced somehow. And there's something else there. Something we need to be very careful about approaching. What kind of something? Maria asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected. Something that's been living in these woods longer than any of us, I said. Something that my grandmother's stories prepared me for. Jake started to speak, then stopped. Whatever he'd seen through the trees had convinced him that normal explanations were no longer adequate. What's the plan? Maria asked. I thought about the stories, about the traditional ways of dealing with the crackle. According to Cherokee legend, they weren't inherently hostile. They were protectors, guardians of places that held spiritual significance. But they could be territorial, especially if they perceived humans as threats to the deep woods they called home. I'm going to try to communicate with it, I said. In Cherokee tradition, these beings, they can understand our language, our intentions. Sometimes they can be reasoned with. Atsadi, Jake said urgently. That thing is 8 feet tall and could probably tear us apart barehanded. Maybe we should call for backup, get some serious firepower out here. Guns won't help, I said with certainty I didn't entirely feel. This isn't something you can shoot your way out of, and if we come at it with aggression, those people will die. I touched my grandmother's medicine pouch again, drawing strength from the connection to 7 generations of Cherokee who had walked these mountains and understood their secrets. I need you both to stay here, I said. If something goes wrong, if the situation deteriorates, get back to the main trail and call for a full evacuation of the area. Don't try to be heroes. Before either of them could object, I stepped out of cover and began walking toward the fire. The creature noticed me immediately, its massive head turned in my direction, and those ancient eyes fixed on me with an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient. The humming stopped, and the Coleman family seemed to shake themselves slightly, as if emerging from a light trance. I stopped about 20 feet from the fire and did something that would have seemed ridiculous to anyone watching. I sat down cross-legged on the forest floor and began to speak in Cherokee. Sio kekle, kudle, tskeyoy, Cherokee dayuluhi, muinadasgri. Hello, Ancient One. Peace, I am Cherokee. I seek understanding. The creature's head tilted slightly, studying me. Then, impossibly, it responded. Not in Cherokee, but in sounds that carried meaning nonetheless, deep, resonant vocalizations that seemed to bypass language entirely and communicate directly with some older part of consciousness. I understood somehow, that it was asking why I had come to this place, why I had followed the family into its territory. Unali gadogve, ditiohi ha gaduhi, novgi edadihi. The people are lost. They need to return home. Their children are afraid. The creature looked at the family, then back at me. When it spoke again, the meaning that came through was complex sadness, loneliness, and a deep weariness that spoke of centuries spent in isolation. It had taken the family not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for companionship, for connection with beings that could appreciate the songs and stories of the deep woods. But it understood that they didn't belong here, that they were afraid rather than comforted by its presence. Mrs. Coleman chose that moment to look directly at me, her eyes wide with recognition and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, "please help us, our children." The creature turned at the sound of her voice, and for a moment I saw something almost tender in its ancient features. It understood fear, understood the bonds between parents and children. I stood slowly, keeping my movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'll take them home," I said, speaking in English now but maintaining the respectful tone I'd used in Cherokee. "They don't belong in the deep woods, but I understand why you brought them here." The creature stood as well, rising to its full height. For a moment I thought I'd misjudged the situation, that it was about to defend its claim to the family. But instead, it stepped back into the shadows at the edge of the firelight. The message was clear. I could take them, but our encounter wasn't over. As I helped the Coleman family to their feet, I realized that finding them had been the easy part. Getting them safely out of the deep woods, out of territory that something ancient and powerful considered its own, would be considerably more difficult. The creature was still out there, watching from the darkness, and I had the distinct feeling that it wasn't finished with any of us. The walk back toward civilization should have been a relief. The Coleman family stayed close to me, the parents holding their children tightly, everyone moving with the desperate energy of people who had glimpsed something beyond their understanding and wanted nothing more than to return to a world that made sense. But we weren't alone in the darkness. The creature followed us, staying just beyond the reach of our flashlights but making no effort to hide its presence. I could hear it moving through the underbrush parallel to our path, occasionally catching glimpses of its massive silhouette between the trees. The family heard it too. Little Jimmy kept looking over his shoulder, and his teenage sister Kate walked so close to her father that they were practically joined at the hip. "Is it going to hurt us?" Mrs. Coleman asked quietly as we navigated around a fallen tree. "I don't think so," I said, though I wasn't entirely certain. The Cherokee stories were unclear about what happened when the Kekle felt their territory was threatened. Some legends spoke of peaceful coexistence, of arrangements made between the old ones and my ancestors. Others told darker tales of people who vanished into the deep woods and were never seen again. We'd been walking for about an hour when Jake and Maria caught up with us, emerging from the forest like ghosts made solid. Jake looked shaken but relieved to see the family safe. Maria's expression was more complex. She kept glancing at the shadows around us, clearly aware that we were being watched. "How are they?" she asked, nodding toward the Colemans. "Exhausted, scared, but physically unharmed," I said. "Whatever that thing wanted, it wasn't to hurt them." "What did it want?" Jake asked. I thought about the communication I'd had with the creature, the sense of ancient loneliness and yearning that had come through its vocalizations. Company, I think. It's been alone in these woods for a very long time. "Alone?" Mr. Coleman spoke up for the first time since we'd started walking. "There were others, in the shadows around the fire. We couldn't see them clearly, but..." My blood went cold. "Others?" Mrs. Coleman nodded. 3 or 4 at least, maybe more. They stayed back, but we could hear them moving around, communicating with each other in those sounds. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If there was a group of these creatures, if they were coordinating their actions, then the situation was far more complex than I'd realized. A single Kekle protecting its territory was one thing. A group of them was something else entirely. That's when I heard it. The singing again, but coming from multiple directions now. 3 distinct voices, maybe 4, creating a harmony that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The sound seemed to come from the trees themselves, surrounding us in a web of ancient melody. The family stopped walking, their eyes taking on that glazed expression I'd seen around the fire. The Nvigadohitha walking sleep was affecting them again, and this time it was stronger. "Keep moving," I said urgently, gently pushing Mr. Coleman forward. "Don't listen to the singing. Focus on my voice. Focus on getting home." But even as I spoke, I could feel the pull of the harmony myself. It was calling to something deep in my Cherokee blood, something that recognized the songs my ancestors might have heard in these same woods centuries ago. Maria grabbed my arm. "Atsadi, look." Ahead of us, blocking the trail, stood another figure. This one was different from the creature I'd encountered earlier, smaller, more feminine in its proportions, but clearly of the same species. Its eyes reflected our flashlight beams like an animal's, but the intelligence behind them was unmistakably human-like. "They're not going to let us leave," Jake said, his voice tight with fear and the beginnings of panic. "No," I said, understanding flooding through me as I watched more shapes emerge from the trees around us. "They're not trying to stop us. They're trying to communicate." The singing grew louder, more complex, and suddenly I could hear something else within the harmony. Patterns, rhythms, structures that reminded me of the old Cherokee ceremonial songs my grandmother had taught me. This wasn't just vocalization, it was language, storytelling, an attempt to bridge the gap between two species that had shared these mountains for millennia. I stopped walking and sat down cross-legged on the trail, ignoring Jake's protests and the frightened murmurs of the Coleman family. If these creatures wanted to communicate, I was going to listen with every bit of Cherokee wisdom my bloodline could provide. The singing continued, and gradually meaning began to emerge from the alien harmony. Images formed in my mind, not visual exactly, but concepts that bypassed language entirely. I saw the deep woods as they experienced them, ancient, sacred, under threat from the expanding human world. I felt their loneliness, their confusion at the changes that had transformed their territory over the past century. But most clearly, I understood their request. They wanted me to witness, to carry their story back to the human world. They were the last of their kind in these mountains, guardians of places that would soon be lost to development and tourism. They had taken the Coleman family not as prey, but as an attempt to find someone who could understand, who could help bridge the gap between the old world and the new. When the singing stopped, the largest of the creatures, the one I'd first encountered, stepped forward into the circle of our flashlights. It looked directly at me and spoke, not in the complex vocalizations I'd heard before, but in heavily accented but recognizable English. "You understand," it said, the words seeming to cause physical effort. "Your people knew us before." "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother told me stories, the Cherokee remember." "Stories," it repeated, and I heard something like relief in its voice. "Yes, stories important. We are becoming story. Soon, only story." The weight of what it was telling me settled in my chest like a stone. These creatures were dying out, their population too small to survive, their habitat shrinking every year. They weren't monsters or myths, they were the last remnants of something ancient that had once shared the continent with my own ancestors. "What do you want from us?" I asked. "Remember," it said simply. "Tell. Let humans know. We were here. We are still here." I stood slowly, feeling the eyes of both species upon me, the terrified Coleman family and the ancient creatures that had called these woods home since before history began. "I'll remember," I said. "I'll tell the stories." The creature nodded once, then stepped back into the shadows. The others followed, melting into the forest with a silence that seemed impossible for beings of their size. Within minutes, we were alone on the trail with only the normal sounds of the night forest around us. The Coleman family would recover, would return to their lives with a story that no one would believe. Jake would file a report that mentioned bears and possible illegal camping, carefully avoiding any details that might damage his career. Maria would understand and keep the deeper truth to herself. But I would remember. I would carry the story of the Kekle Kudle forward, adding it to the collection of Cherokee wisdom that had somehow survived genocide and forced assimilation. As we walked the final miles back to civilization, I touched my grandmother's medicine pouch and whispered a prayer in Cherokee, not for protection, but for the ancient ones who had trusted me with their truth. Some stories, I realized, were too important to let die. 3 months after the Coleman incident, I was sitting in the old Cherokee Community Center in Robbinsville, North Carolina, surrounded by elders and young people gathered for the monthly storytelling circle. My great-aunt Lily, now 93 and the keeper of more traditional knowledge than anyone else I knew, had asked me to share what she called the story that needs telling. The official report on the Coleman family disappearance had been filed and forgotten. Lost hikers recovered safely after overnight exposure, was how the local newspaper had described it. The family themselves had tried to tell their story to a few friends and relatives, but the details sounded so impossible that people either dismissed them as trauma-induced hallucinations or simply changed the subject. Only the Cherokee community was ready to hear the truth. "Sio, Aniunwia," I began, using the formal greeting and the word for the real people, our name for ourselves. "I want to tell you about something that happened in the Uwari, something that connects us to the oldest stories our people have carried." I spoke in Cherokee first, then English, describing the encounter in the deep woods, the communication with the Kekle Kudle, and the trust they had placed in me to carry their story forward. The elders nodded knowingly. They had heard similar tales from their own grandparents. The younger people listened with the mixture of skepticism and wonder that comes with growing up between two worlds. When I finished, Great Aunt Lily stood slowly, her arthritis making the movement difficult but her voice still strong. "Una dot lisviga, nivi gayuha," truth-telling, ancient knowledge. She looked around the circle, her eyes settling on each face. "Some of you think this is just old stories, galanlati, that belongs in the past. But the past and present are not so separate for our people. The Kekle Kudle have always been part of these mountains, part of our understanding of how the world works." A young man named David, home from college with a degree in environmental science, raised his hand. "Aunt Lily, with respect, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of creatures like Bigfoot. DNA analysis of hair samples, footprint cassette, all comes back either inconclusive or easily explained." Lily smiled the patient smile of an elder dealing with the certainty of youth. "Tsiohi, nephew, science is a powerful tool. But it is not the only tool for understanding the world. Our people survived in these mountains for thousands of years using different kinds of knowledge." She turned to me. "Atsadi, tell them about the morning after." I hadn't planned to share this part of the story, but Lily's request carried the weight of traditional authority. "The next morning I went back to the site where we found the family," I said, just to make sure we hadn't missed anything in our evidence collection. The fire ring was gone, not just cold, but completely erased, as if it had never existed. The ground where the creatures had stood showed no sign of disturbance. It was like the whole encounter had been cleaned up, removed from the physical world. "But you found something," Lily prompted. I nodded, reaching into my pocket to pull out a small object wrapped in red cloth. This was placed on a fallen log exactly where I had sat to communicate with them. I unwrapped the object carefully. It was a piece of carved wood, about 4 inches long, shaped into what was clearly meant to be a miniature figure. The carving was incredibly detailed despite its small Sizia standing human form with arms outstretched, as if offering something or asking for acceptance. "The carving technique is old," I continued, "very old, similar to artifacts we found from pre-contact Cherokee sites, but the wood itself is fresh. Someone with traditional knowledge carved this recently, using techniques that most people thought were lost." David leaned forward to examine the carving more closely. "Could be. There are still people who know the old wood carving methods." "True," I said, "but this was placed in a location that only the creatures and I knew about. It was left there as a gift, or maybe as proof that the encounter really happened." Great Aunt Lily took the carving from me, holding it up to the light and examining it with eyes that had seen nearly a century of change in Cherokee country. "Didana whiskey," she said quietly. "Medicine work. This was made by someone who understands the old ways of calling protection, of sealing agreements between different peoples." She handed it back to me. "The Kekle Kudle want more than just to be remembered, nephew. They want to be acknowledged as part of the community that shares these mountains. They're asking for what our ancestors would have called Galdugi cooperative relationship." The implications of what she was saying settled over the circle like a weight. If these creatures were real, if they were intelligent enough to carve ceremonial objects and place them as diplomatic gifts, then they represented something unprecedented in the modern world, a non-human intelligence that was trying to establish formal contact with humanity. "What are we supposed to do with that?" asked Sarah, a young woman who worked for the tribal government. "Even if we believe the story, even if we accept that these creatures exist, how do we integrate that into the real world? How do we protect them legally, culturally, practically?" It was a good question, one that had been keeping me awake at night for 3 months. I don't know, I admitted. But I think the first step is what we're doing right now, keeping the story alive, making sure the knowledge doesn't get lost. The Cherokee have always understood that the natural world contains more than science can easily measure. Great Aunt Lily nodded approvingly. Stories are seeds, she said. Plant them properly, and they grow into understanding. Plant them in the right hearts, and they grow into action. Over the following weeks, word of the story spread through Cherokee communities in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Oklahoma. Some people dismissed it, of course, but others listened with the kind of attention that our people reserve for important knowledge. A month later, I received a call from Dr. Maria Gonzalez, an anthropologist at Western Carolina University who specialized in Cherokee oral traditions. "I've been hearing about your encounter in the Uwharrie," she said. "Would you be willing to participate in a formal documentation project? Not for publication necessarily, but for preservation. There are patterns in your story that connect to similar accounts from other tribal communities across North America." It turned out that indigenous peoples from Alaska to Florida had traditional knowledge of large, bipedal, intelligent creatures that lived in deep wilderness areas. The names were different: Saskiz to the Halkomelem people, Tsemekwes to the Lumi, Fuke to various southeastern tribes, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. More importantly, there had been other recent encounters, other attempts at communication that suggested these creatures were actively trying to establish contact with indigenous communities specifically. "They recognize us," Dr. Gonzalez explained during our first interview. "They understand that tribal peoples have maintained spiritual and practical relationships with the natural world that might make us better equipped to understand their perspective." 6 months after the Coleman incident, I was back in the Uwharrie National Forest, but this time I wasn't alone. Dr. Gonzalez, Great Aunt Lily, and 3 other Cherokee elders had come with me to a site about 5 miles from where the original encounter had taken place. We were responding to an invitation. 2 weeks earlier, another ranger had found a series of carved symbols on trees along a remote trail, symbols that matched patterns in traditional Cherokee pictography, but were clearly fresh. The message, when translated, was simple: "Come, talk, learn." As we walked deeper into the forest, following the marked trail of symbols, I found myself thinking about the continuity of stories, about the way knowledge flowed from one generation to the next like water following ancient riverbeds. My grandmother had prepared me for this moment without either of us knowing it. Her stories, dismissed by my parents as folklore, had turned out to be essential knowledge for navigating a world where the impossible was simply another form of reality. The Cherokee word for this kind of prepared understanding is duivkabing, ready for what comes, having the tools to handle the unexpected. It's a concept that encompasses practical skills, spiritual knowledge, and the wisdom to recognize when the old stories are really instructions for the future. As we approached the clearing where fresh symbols indicated we should wait, I touched my grandmother's medicine pouch one more time and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Some stories, I had learned, were not just meant to be preserved. Some stories were meant to be lived. The forest around us began to sing. "My name is Kanati Adawehi, and I am the 7th generation of my family to serve as guardian of these ancient forests." The name Kanati was given to me by my grandmother, Elisi. In the traditional Cherokee naming ceremony, it means first man and guardian of the hunt, though in my case, I hunt for lost souls rather than game. The Olympic National Forest stretches before me like a living cathedral, its towering Douglas firs and western hemlocks forming pillars that have stood since before my ancestors walked the Trail of Tears. As a supervisory park ranger with 15 years of service, I've seen things that would drive most men to early retirement or the bottom of a whiskey bottle. But the old Cherokee ways run deep in my blood, and Elisi always told me that our family was chosen to walk between worlds, the seen and unseen. It was a cold October morning when dispatch crackled to life over my radio, interrupting my morning patrol of the Hoh River Trail. "Ranger Adawehi, we have a code red missing persons. Family of 4 failed to return from overnight camping at Sol Duke Hot Springs. Last seen yesterday at 1,400 hours. The number 7 has always been sacred to our people. 7 clans, 7 levels to the universe, 7 days for a naming ceremony." But that morning, as I drove my patrol vehicle through the mist-shrouded forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that the number held darker significance. This would be the 7th missing persons case in these woods in the past 2 months. The Caldwell family from Portland, Mark, his wife Sarah, teenage daughter Jessica, and 8-year-old son Tommy. Their campsite told a story that made my Cherokee blood run cold. The tent was still perfectly erected, sleeping bags laid out as if the family had simply vanished mid-conversation. No signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away from the site. Just 4 empty camping chairs arranged around a cold fire pit and the lingering smell of fear that seems to cling to places where something unnatural has occurred. My partner, Ranger Collins, emerged from the tree line shaking his head. "Kay, this is just like the others. No trail, no disturbance patterns. It's like they just disappeared." I knelt beside the fire pit, placing my palm against the earth as Elise had taught me. The old ways don't die easily in my family. My grandmother could read the forest like other people read newspapers, sensing the ebb and flow of life energy that most folks never notice. As my fingers pressed into the soil, I felt it, a wrongness that made my stomach clench. The natural harmony of this place had been shattered. "We need to expand the search grid," I said, standing and brushing dirt from my hands. "And radio for additional units. Whatever took them, it's still out there." That first night, as we set up base camp for the search operation, I performed a private ceremony my grandmother had taught me. Using traditional tobacco and sage, I offered prayers to the nightland spirits and asked for protection for my search team. The Cherokee believe that some creatures walk the boundary between our world and the spirit realm, beings that are neither fully alive nor dead, existing in the shadows between realities. As smoke from my offering drifted upward through the canopy, I heard something that chilled me to the bone, a sound like no animal I'd encountered in 15 years of forest service. It started as a low, resonant howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, rising in pitch until it became almost human, almost like a voice calling out in a language older than words. The other rangers around the campfire fell silent, their faces pale in the flickering light. "What the hell was that?" Collins whispered. I didn't answer, couldn't answer, because deep in my Cherokee soul, I knew exactly what it was. Elise had told me stories, passed down through 7 generations of forest guardians, about the crackle, the ancient hairy giants that once shared these mountains with our people. Stories I'd dismissed as folklore until now. The howling came again, closer this time, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. In the darkness beyond our firelight, 2 massive eyes reflected our flames, eyes that held an intelligence that was definitely not animal, but not quite human either. They watched us for what felt like an eternity before melting back into the shadows, leaving only the smell of musk and decay. "We're not dealing with a normal predator," I told my team, my voice steady despite the fear crawling up my spine. "Everyone stays within sight of the fire tonight. No one goes into the woods alone." But as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the star-punctured darkness through the forest canopy, I knew that whatever had taken the Caldwell family was far more dangerous than any ordinary predator. The old Cherokee stories spoke of creatures that could mimic human voices, that could walk upright like men but possessed the strength to tear a person in half. And somewhere out there in the ancient darkness, 4 innocent people were counting on me to bring them home. Dawn broke gray and cold over our search camp, but the light did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the forest. My radio crackled to life at 600 sharp. "All units, this is base. We have additional missing persons reports. Hikers failed to return from the 7 Lakes Basin Trail." 7 again. The number seemed to mock me. I assembled my search team at first light, 6 experienced rangers plus myself, forming the sacred number 7 that my ancestors believed held protective power. Following traditional Cherokee protocol for dangerous hunts, I smudged each member with sage smoke and offered a brief prayer to the 4 directions. Collins raised an eyebrow at the ceremony, but didn't question it. He'd worked with me long enough to respect the old ways, even if he didn't understand them. "We'll split into 3 teams," I announced, spreading a topographical map across the hood of my vehicle. "The grid search has to cover approximately 40 square miles of dense forest. Team Alpha takes the northwestern quadrant, Bravo covers the river valleys to the south, and Charlie, that's Collins and myself, will investigate the area where the newest disappearances occurred." The 7 Lakes Basin Trail wound through some of the most pristine wilderness in the Olympic Peninsula. As Collins and I hiked the muddy path, I found myself falling into the tracking rhythm my grandfather had taught me as a boy. Cherokee hunters learn to read the forest like a book. Every broken twig, every disturbed leaf, every subtle change in the natural pattern tells a story. What I found along that trail defied every law of nature I'd learned in my ranger training. The first anomaly appeared 3 miles up the trail, a footprint pressed into the soft earth beside a small creek. But this wasn't any human footprint I'd ever seen. It measured nearly 18 inches long and 7 inches wide, with deep toe impressions that suggested massive weight. The print was fresh, made within the last 12 hours based on the sharpness of the edges. Jesus Christ, Collins breathed, kneeling beside the track. What kind of animal makes a print like that? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I pulled out my grandmother's medicine bag, a small leather pouch I'd carried for 20 years but never thought I'd actually need to use. Inside were items she'd gathered from sacred places: eagle feathers, bear claws, river stones blessed by Cherokee medicine men. My hands trembled slightly as I scattered a pinch of red ochre clay around the print. Elise told me stories about tracks like this, I said quietly. The old-timers called them crackle sign, but I always thought they were just legends. More prints appeared as we followed the trail deeper into the forest. They seemed to parallel the human hiking trail, sometimes crossing it, sometimes disappearing entirely, only to reappear hundreds of yards ahead. Whatever was making these tracks moved with purpose and intelligence, following patterns that suggested deliberate hunting behavior. The second anomaly nearly stopped my heart cold. Hanging from a massive cedar branch about 15 feet off the ground was a child's backpack, small, purple, with cartoon characters on the sides. The pack belonged to 8-year-old Tommy Caldwell, but there was no way a normal predator could have carried it that high, and no way the boy could have climbed up there himself. "Boost me up," I told Collins. "I need to get that pack down." As I climbed toward the suspended backpack, the smell hit me, a rank, overwhelming musk that seemed to coat the inside of my nostrils and throat. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered, part animal, part decay, part something else entirely, something that didn't belong in the natural world. The backpack was secured to the branch by what looked like deliberate knots, not random snagging, but intentional placement. Inside, I found Tommy's inhaler, his Game Boy, and a drawing he'd made of his family camping. The paper was damp but unharmed, as if it had been protected from the elements. That's when I heard it. A voice, thin and high like a child's, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest, "Help me. Please help me." Collins and I exchanged glances. The voice was definitely human, definitely young, definitely in distress. But something about it felt wrong, too perfect, too clear, carrying impossibly far through the dense forest. "Tommy?" I called back. "Tommy Caldwell, is that you? Help me. Please help me." The voice repeated exactly, with identical inflection and timing, like a recording being played back. My Cherokee grandfather had warned me about creatures that could mimic human speech, that used the voices of their victims to lure other prey. The crackle were said to be master mimics, able to perfectly reproduce any sound they heard. But even knowing it was a trap, we had to investigate. If there was even a chance that one of the missing children was alive out there, we couldn't ignore it. We followed the voice deeper into the forest, our service weapons drawn but feeling pitifully inadequate against whatever we were tracking. The calls led us off the main trail and into a section of old-growth forest where the trees grew so thick that afternoon felt like twilight. The voice stopped, just as we entered a small clearing dominated by a massive fallen log. The silence was absolute, no bird songs, no insect buzzes, no rustling of small animals. Even the wind seemed to have died. That's when I saw them. Standing at the far edge of the clearing, partially concealed behind the trunk of an enormous Douglas fir, was a figure that would haunt my dreams for the rest of my life. It stood at least 9 feet tall, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hanging down past its knees. But it was the face that truly terrified me, almost human but wrong in every detail, with eyes that held an ancient, predatory intelligence. The creature watched us for perhaps 10 seconds, its massive head tilted slightly as if studying us. Then it opened its mouth and spoke in perfect imitation of Tommy Caldwell's voice. "Help me. Please help me." Collins raised his weapon, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "You'll only make it angry." The crackle, for I now had no doubt that's what we faced, seemed to smile at my words. It took one step backward and vanished into the forest with impossible silence for something so large. But not before I saw what was clutched in its massive hand, a piece of torn fabric that matched Sarah Caldwell's hiking jacket. The setting sun painted the Olympic forest in shades of blood and shadow as our search teams regrouped at base camp. Radio chatter filled the air with negative reports. No signs of the missing families, no additional tracks, no evidence except for the impossible prints Collins and I had discovered. I sat apart from the others, my grandmother's medicine bag open in my lap, trying to make sense of what we'd encountered. The sacred items seemed to pulse with their own energy in the fading light, the eagle feathers stirring without any breeze, the river stones warm to the touch despite the cooling air. "Elise," I whispered to the gathering darkness, using the Cherokee word for grandmother, "I need your guidance now more than ever." As if in response to my prayer, the wind carried a scent that transported me instantly to childhood. Wood smoke and sage, the smell of my grandmother's cabin in the mountains of North Carolina. With the scent came memory, her voice telling me about the ancient pact between our people and the forest spirits, the agreements made in blood and sacred tobacco that kept the balance between worlds. "The crackle, kudle are not evil," her voice echoed in my memory. "They are protectors of the deep forest, guardians of places where humans should not go. But when the balance is disturbed, when their territory is threatened, they defend it in the only way they know how." Understanding struck me like lightning. The missing families weren't random victims, they were warnings. The recent expansion of hiking trails into previously untouched areas of the forest had violated ancient boundaries, disturbed sacred spaces that had been left alone for generations. I keyed my radio with shaking hands. "All teams, this is Kanati. Return to base camp immediately. I'm calling off the grid search." Collins looked at me as if I'd lost my mind. "Kay, we've got 8 people missing out there. We can't just give up." "I'm not giving up," I replied, rising to my feet and shouldering my pack. "I'm changing tactics. This isn't a rescue operation anymore, it's a negotiation." Using the GPS coordinates from our encounter, I led Collins back into the forest as full darkness fell. This time I came prepared not with weapons but with offerings. Traditional Cherokee tobacco, sacred white corn, eagle feathers blessed by tribal elders. Items my grandmother had taught me to use when dealing with the spirits of the borderlands. The clearing where we'd seen the creature looked different at night, older somehow, more primal, as if we'd stepped backward through time to an age when giants walked the earth. I arranged my offerings in the traditional Cherokee pattern, tobacco to the east for new beginnings, corn to the south for growth, sage to the west for healing, and sweetgrass to the north for wisdom. "I am Kanati Adawehi," I called into the darkness, using the ancient Cherokee phrases my grandmother had taught me. "7th son of the Wolf clan, guardian of these forests, speaker for those who cannot speak for themselves. I come seeking balance, not battle." The forest remained silent for long moments. Then gradually I became aware of a presence watching us from the trees. Not just one presence, several. They moved through the darkness with the silence of shadows, circling our small clearing like predators evaluating prey. The largest emerged first, the same creature we'd encountered that afternoon. In the moonlight filtering through the canopy, I could see details that daylight had hidden, the silver streaking through its dark fur, the old scars across its massive chest, the profound intelligence in its deep-set eyes. This was no mere animal but something far older and more complex. "You seek the lost ones," it said, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The creature's voice was deep and resonant, speaking English with an accent I couldn't place, perhaps the remnant of some forgotten Cherokee dialect. "I do," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. 8 people who wandered into places they didn't understand. They meant no harm. The creature tilted its massive head. "Harm is not always intentional. Your people build trails where trails should not be, bring noise and waste to places that have known only silence. The deep forest grows smaller each year." Other shapes emerged from the darkness. A family group, I realized. A smaller female, 2 adolescents, and something that made my breath catch, a juvenile creature no taller than a human child, playing with what looked like Tommy Caldwell's toy truck. "They're alive?" I asked. "The young ones adapt quickly," the large male replied. "They learn our ways, forget the poison of your civilization. They will be cared for, protected, raised as our own. But their families are searching for them. They're frightened, confused. The creature's eyes flashed with something that might have been anger. As we were frightened when your ancestors first came to these mountains. As we are frightened now, watching our territory shrink year by year. I understood then what my grandmother had tried to teach me about walking between worlds. This wasn't about good versus evil, civilization versus wilderness. It was about finding balance between two peoples who both had legitimate claims to this ancient land. What would it take for them to be returned? I asked. The creature considered for a long moment. Close the new trails. Restore the forbidden places to silence. Acknowledge that some parts of the forest belong to others, not to your kind. It was an impossible request. I had no authority to close federal trails, no power to override the National Park Service's expansion plans. But looking into those ancient eyes, seeing the missing children safe but forever changed in the arms of their new family, I knew I had to try. I'll speak to the council, I promised. I'll make them understand. The creature nodded slowly. You carry the old blood, Guardian. Your grandmother's spirit walks with you. We will release the lost ones when the new trails are closed and the old boundaries respected. As dawn broke over the Olympic forest, I returned to base camp with a story no one would believe and a mission that would likely end my career. But as I looked back one final time toward the deep forest, I saw them, 8 figures standing at the edge of the tree line, alive and unharmed, waiting for the world to remember that some places are sacred, some beings are beyond our understanding, and some negotiations require more than words. The Kekle Kudle faded back into the shadows, but their message was clear. The ancient pact between our peoples could be renewed, but only if we learn to respect the boundaries between worlds once again. In my report, I would write that the search had been suspended due to hazardous conditions. But privately, I began the long process of contacting tribal elders, environmental lawyers, and anyone who might help close those trails and honor the old agreements. Because sometimes being a guardian means protecting more than just human lives. Sometimes it means protecting the sacred spaces where legends still walk, and the fragile balance between the seen and unseen worlds.